We made this.
Make It So, a Star Trek Universe podcast, is now on Patreon, where you can support the show's production and gain access to all kinds of bonus features and content. To subscribe, check out what we offer at patreon.com/Make It So podcast. That's patreon.com/Make It So podcast. Thanks for listening.
Engage.
And Helmsman.
I'm Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the Federation Starship Enterprise.
Michael Burnham, pleased to meet you.
What we leave behind is not as important as how we've lived.
We will continue exploring, discovering new worlds, new civilizations. That is the United Federation of Planets. That is Starfleet.
Make it so.
Hello everyone and welcome to Make It So, a Star Trek Universe podcast and our beginning of the coverage of our Star Trek Discovery recap from season 1 and 2 just before we get into the new season 3, which we're not too sure about when that's going to air actually, so we thought we'd take the time to go through seasons 1 and 2, or get as far as we can anyway until season 3 does appear back on our screens, because last time we were here we were talking about Star Trek Picard, and we thought it'd only be right that we finished Picard a few weeks ago now, at the time of recording. Tony and I discussed the season as an overall look at the season, and we had Darren Mooney on the last episode of Picard, and we've got him here on this episode of Star Trek Discovery. So, and it's not only just one episode, it's 2 episodes, and we'll go into the reasons why that is shortly. But first of all, please welcome Darren Mooney, who is apparently a synth, and I need to explain to you why, Darren, but you're apparently a synth now.
Why am I a synth? What happened?
Okay.
I was going to say I'm thrilled to join you on this mission of rediscovery, but let's get to that later.
Let's get to that later. So after your podcast with me a few weeks back and the airing of Star Trek Picard, we obviously went through the episode, and some of the feedback that we got on Facebook was that they loved the episode. They actually loved your thoughts and your knowledge on Star Trek, but they thought your knowledge might be a bit too much. So one of some of the words that were like, I'm awed by. This was from Colleen, I think, and she said that I'm awed by your memory alpha-like knowledge of Trek.
Oh, so thank you.
That's nice, isn't it?
Yeah.
And of course, Tony obviously dives in there as he would. And calls you the Data. If Data was a podcaster, he'd be Darren. And then finally, I'm calling it now. This is what Colleen basically said. She says, I'm calling it now. Darren's a synth. And Tony replies, I've heard less likely theories.
But to be fair, my other podcast husband, Andrew, has been known to refer to me as a robot that generates movie opinions. So, you know... And did this movie make Darren cry is kind of a recurring motif in Irish film criticism circles. Because I never cry because I have no soul or heart. So yeah, it's apparently not. So it's maybe not that outlandish a position to take.
Oh, that's fair enough then. I think we've got to the bottom of it. Or have you been in human form before and are now technically a Gollum synth? And are you still Darren Mooney? That's the big question that's happening on Twitter at the moment. Is Picard still Picard? So are you still Darren Mooney, Darren?
Well, we're going to have to wait until we get to the season 2 finale to get into that, Kurt, I think.
Oh, we are. So, I think we should maybe delve into season 1 of Star Trek Discovery. So just before we do that, actually, I just wanted to go through a couple of things with, because it is the beginning of our Star Trek Discovery journey and our rediscovery, as I'll take that off you before. Just a little brief history on Star Trek Discovery, because it has had quite a troubled production, even to the likes of today. Really, it's been quite struggle, hasn't it? So, this was the first episode was going to be directed by David Semmel and was eventually directed by David Semmel. But I know that Fuller wanted to have Edgar Wright. That was right, wasn't it? That he wanted to have Edgar Wright on there. And there was a lot of things behind the scenes with regards to that. The actual Discovery itself was announced back in November of 2015. and it was set to air in 2017, but it didn't actually air till September of that year. And we had Fuller announce in June 2016 that it would consist of 13 episodes, which moved up to 15.
Yeah.
These, I would say, being the 2 episodes that were added, effectively. Whether or not I'm right with that, I'm not entirely sure. I can't quite remember that, but that kind of happened. And then Fuller kind of left as well, didn't he? So there was quite a lot of things going on with Discovery up until that point. And do you have much more to add to that? There's millions of things we could talk about, but I'm sure there's
absolutely millions of things. But very, very quickly, like the situation of Fuller is absolutely fascinating because it gives a sense of what's going on with Discovery, kind of like thematically and in terms of where it's trying to position itself in the TV landscape. Because Fuller is a creator who is generally regarded as one of the low-key auteurs of modern television. Fuller is a producer who has a very distinct aesthetic, and if you've watched his shows, you'll pick up on what that is immediately. Things like, say, Pushing Daisies. He did some stuff on Dead Like Me for a while before he left there as well. Hannibal, which is his longest-running show, or the longest-running show that he worked on, which ran for 3 seasons as well. But even things like American Gods, which was one of the points of tension between himself and CBS, because Fuller was trying to split his time between doing Discovery and also doing American Gods. But one of the points of contention between Fuller and CBS was apparently the level of authorship and the level of control. And what you mentioned there with Edgar Wright is very much part of that as well. There's a sense in which Fuller maybe envisaged Discovery existing in the landscape of modern television as we tend to think of it in terms of auteurs and creators. Stuff like, say, David Simon, David Milch, David Chase. But like this idea of kind of a very strong authorial vision which comes from the showrunner down and basically shapes the show kind of outward of that. And I mean, when you watch these episodes, it's notable that Fuller, while he provided an outline to the first season, he's only credited on the first 3 episodes. He's only credited on the teleplay of the first episode in particular. But you can get a sense even in those of kind of Fuller as a writer, as an artist, as somebody who has these kind of, as an auteur, as a creator who has particular things that interest him. And like, you know, not to jump too far ahead, the most obvious example is the obsession with death that runs through these 3 episodes, which is a very Fuller theme. Obviously, Fuller worked on Dead Like Me. Hannibal is a show about serial killers who turn dead bodies into art, for example. And it's notable that the biggest, like, the casting overlap between American Gods and the Vulcan Hello is the casting Chris Obi as T'Kuvma, Obi having played Anubis, the god of death, on American Gods with Brian Fuller, to pick another example. And, like, it's very much one, and it's notable that, like, you know, fans argue back and forth about continuity and how Discovery fits in continuity and whether Discovery rewrote continuity. And, you know, it's all very elastic, but one of the big changes that it does actually make to continuity is its reinvention of the Klingons. And that, again, is a very Fuller-esque touch, because the biggest change that it makes the Klingons isn't to do with the makeup or anything like that, because that stuff's been changed before, and I'm sure we'll talk about it later. The biggest conceptual change to the Klingons is that Fuller turns them into effectively a death cult, because historically Klingons have been established as a culture that have no patience for death, who just see their bodies as empty vessels. But all of a sudden, when Fuller's reinventing them here, he turns them into this kind of like pop Egyptian motif, where they're riding around with ships that are literally stacked with the dead bodies of their colleagues or their predecessors or their ancestors, which is something that kind of Fuller's very, very interested in, and kind of runs throughout the show as well. This idea that, you know, the sarcophagus ship, it's literally called the sarcophagus ship, because it's like they carry around the dead with them. And so you have that sense of Fuller running through that stuff as well. And like you have that with Edgar Wright, where Fuller wanted to take a film director, a director with a very unique stylistic sensibility. You watch an Edgar Wright production, you watch an Edgar Wright film, you watch Spaced, and you immediately know that it's Edgar Wright, because he has a very, very strong sensibility and a very strong sense of what he's trying to do. And then you have kind of to bring him in and to ask him to put his mark on the pilot of or premiere of a new Star Trek series would be a very strong authorial statement. And you have Fuller himself, who allegedly had a plan that was going to consist of rebooting the show every season as an anthology, and then kind of moving gradually closer and closer to the present or the post-Nemesis future of Star Trek as well, which is a very strong statement of authorial intent. And you have that brushing against what CBS kind of wanted it to be, which I think was perhaps something a bit more generic and a bit more Star Trek-y, a bit more conventional television. It's very expensive, it's very stylish, but it looks a bit more like Star Trek, it feels a bit more like Star Trek. And it's noticeable that, like, when you get to the second season, where Fuller's influence has been all but completely removed from the show, that you end up with a version of Discovery that is a lot more like generic Star Trek than the first season was. And, you know, I think that we will, you know, over the course of the season, you're going to talk about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm very much in the camp of, I think that when you're making something, it should feel unique and distinct, even if it's working in an existing franchise. I think the best parts of the Star Trek franchise are the parts that have that strong sense of authorship. Like, it's notable that Fuller brought on Nicholas Meyer to serve as executive producer on the first season of Discovery. He rewrote and reinvented Star Trek twice. He did it with Star Trek The Wrath of Khan, which felt like no other Star Trek installment before that point, and actually generated fan outrage on par with what we see with Discovery. People like literally taking out advertisements in Variety and The Hollywood Reporter to protest that this is not Star Trek. This is not what I want Star Trek to be. And then he did it again a couple of years later with Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, which also provoked fan outrage, where you had like have you read the novelization of Star Trek VI? It's literally this gigantic screed against how Star Trek VI mischaracterizes Kirk, portrays Kirk as a character who is not the character of Kirk the fans know and love. And yet, despite that, I would argue is one of the best Star Trek films. And again, Deep Space Nine, which is very much the love child of kind of Ira Stephen Bear and his very distinct sensibility within the Star Trek universe. And that's sort of like, I would argue that throughout Star Trek, even within the franchise, when you embrace that sense of authorship, you end up with something that is good and interesting and exciting. And I think that one of the tensions that runs through Discovery, particularly in the first season after Fuller left, is that sense of being caught between wanting something that resembles a piece of prestige television, like, say, Vince Gilligan's Breaking Bad, to pick an example, like, say, David Simon's, The Wire, or Show Me a Hero, versus something that is much more generic, much more recognizable, and much more brand friendly. And you kind of see that push and pull, and you kind of even feel a little bit here, although I think that, in the pilot, which is the only episode that's credited to Fuller as a screenwriter, his influence is much, much more to the fore. It's a very pure distillation, I think, of what Fuller kind of wanted this first season to be.
You're right. I mean, couple of things I wanted to pick up with you on there, especially the type of show that we get with Star Trek Discovery. That, we mentioned about the production issues that we've got. I mean, he brings in Gretchen Berg and Aaron Harberts, and they were from Pushing Daisies. They were serving as co-showrunners with him, and obviously they take up the mantle later on in the season. And then obviously, I'm sure we'll get into their issues later on. Well, we're into the second season, but Star Trek's in a really weird place here. I mean, there hasn't been a series since Enterprise back in 2005. The JJ verse has all but come into the universe, and the Kelvin timeline, and people not liking it, and Kurtzman obviously being involved in that as well. And then we move into what we get here now. Picard. When Picard first came out, there was a lot of fanfare with that because it's a returning character. It's someone who's beloved. And there was a lot of excitement brewed up with that. You mentioned, things like Star Trek VI, for example, changing the way that Star Trek VI, by the way, is one of my favourite films as well. How that changed the mould of what Star Trek could be. And even Next Generation got a lot of slack when that first aired with Jean-Luc Picard as well. So
every Star Trek series has. I mean,
exactly.
Go to the message boards and look at the responses to Deep Space Nine. Even when Deep Space Nine was airing, you had Majel Barrett Roddenberry taking out editorials in Star Trek Communicator explaining this is not Star Trek. You had people while it was on the air, like George Takei saying this is not Star Trek. You have people to this day, like Marina Sirtis, saying this is not Star Trek. This is not what Gene Roddenberry wanted it to be. It's not something that is particular to Discovery. It's just that I think that because we're all online, and social media is what it is, and it kind of reinforces and kind of trumpets and gives people kind of a box to stand on. Those arguments don't go away in the way that they do with, say, The Next Generation, where 3 years into The Next Generation, you've either made your peace with it or you haven't. Or 3 years into Deep Space Nine, you've either stopped watching or it's the best show on television. After Star Trek Wrath of Khan, 5 years later, you either accepted that you got, The Search for Spock and The Voyage Home as well, and that was great, or you've been like, well, I still have the original 79 episodes that I can watch on my own. That sort of thing. And I think that when we talk about fans today being kind of possessive or having fixed visions of the show or what they want from the show, there's a tendency to assume that it's something new, that this outrage or anger or frustration is new, and not to downplay it at all. Like I completely understand. There are parts of franchises where I go, this is not what I want from a franchise. This is not what I expect from it. This is not what I enjoy about it, or not what I kind of want it to give me. So I completely understand. I'm not being flippant or dismissive of that in any way, shape, or form. But I think that we do tend to we tend to overestimate the importance of that, or we tend to assume that this is some new experience that we're only just experiencing now, that Discovery is a point at which the Star Trek fandom fractured, or that the, J.J. Abrams movies are a point where the Star Trek fandom fractured. I can tell you, as somebody who was online during the time that Star Trek Voyager and Star Trek Enterprise were on the air, that if you were in the right places, or the wrong places, if we're being entirely frank, but if you were involved in communities online, you were seeing the same stuff that you see on Twitter, the same stuff that you see on social media, the same stuff that you see on YouTube. You were just seeing it in a more concentrated subset of the internet that you could easily ignore. There are points where I literally, and again, I say this as somebody who has very serious problems with Voyager and who really doesn't like the first few seasons of Enterprise. So I'm not like a fan of those parts of Star Trek, to a huge degree. But even as somebody who was like, this isn't really for me, I had to physically disconnect from message boards at that time because the negativity was just so overwhelming and suffocating. And it's a similar experience that I think you get in certain parts of kind of like, YouTube or kind of, Twitter, where you have that kind of sense of kind of like anger kind of bubbling to the surface. So, when we talk about the fan reaction to stuff like this and it being new and different, you're entirely right to say Star Trek has always been new and different. It was new and different when Kirk was replaced by a bald Yorkshire man with a French name. It was new and different when that Frenchman was replaced by an African American who for some reason had grown hair, despite the fact that he looked really cool when he was Spencer for Hire.
Once he shaved that head, the TV show suddenly became a lot better.
Yeah.
Which was amazing. But no, I mean, one of the things I was going to say actually with the fan thing as well is if anyone hasn't seen it and do get an opportunity to see it, is the Deep Space Nine documentary, What We Left Behind, because that is a real insight into the stuff that they were having to deal with during that show. But yeah, so we are coming into a new era of Star Trek here. I mean, the inherent problems with Discovery's setting for this new Star Trek is you've said in your review that is it a prequel or is it more poignantly a sequel to Star Trek First Contact, or is it a prequel series to the original series? With the whole taking the aesthetical design from the JJ verse as well, and they could have easily sidestepped these issues. And what did you make of the fact that they didn't, or Fuller didn't sidestep this issue and went directly for this to make his own show in this way, coming at it from that point of view that they didn't shy away from what they wanted to do, and they would have known that this would have caused that kind of uproar?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things where if I had, 5 minutes with Brian Fuller and he was entirely candid and honest and not worried about stepping on the toes of anybody that left in charge, because he actually seems like a really nice guy and very professional, I would actually ask him, one of my questions would be, why didn't you just go 100 years into the future, like Roddenberry did with The Next Generation and kind of took a leap forward? Why didn't you take us into the 25th or even 26th centuries and go, look, this is where we are now, and we're so far ahead that we can do what The Next Generation did. We can say, well, we're not going to worry about where the Romulans and Klingons are until we get there. It's not going to be something we're going to focus on in the short term. We're not going to give you Spock immediately or anything like that. We're going to give you a nice clean break and kind of ease you back in. And I would wonder why they didn't do that. That would be my lingering kind of question. And part of me wonders if, there's a sense of, again, Fuller's anthology plan, which was that he would take you from that gap up to the present day, was maybe some sort of compromise along those lines. Because obviously, and you mentioned it there when you mentioned the aesthetics of the Abrams movies. And this is something that is interesting, because the Abrams movies, they are divisive within fandom, to say the least. They are highly contentious. And again, you have that situation in 2013 where a Star Trek convention voted Into Darkness as the worst Star Trek movie, which is, everybody is entitled to their opinion, and everybody likes what they like and don't like what they don't like. But again, part of me is like, if you are voting Into Darkness the worst Star Trek movie ever, I think that's more a statement than an actual opinion on something. I think that, if you're voting that it's worse than The Final Frontier, and I say that as somebody who has a great deal of affection for Row, Row, Row Your Boat, or if you're saying it's better than Star Trek Nemesis, I say as somebody who has watched Nemesis 7 times, I say that, maybe you're being maybe you're voting to make a statement rather than to express an actual opinion about the quality of a work. And again, you kind of have that sense of reaction within fandom to them. But while you have that reaction in fandom to Star Trek, The Abrams movies are actually very popular outside of fandom. You know, both of them made the IMDb top 250 list. They've obviously dropped off in the years since, as tends to happen with blockbusters. Both of them made a lot of money. Into Darkness was the most profitable Star Trek movie in the franchise. Both of them got A cinema scores as well. And, you know, I mean, people generally speaking, even Star Trek fans, even fans who are not necessarily fond of the movies themselves, really like the ensemble as well. And even just colloquially, I know, talking to people who don't enjoy Star Trek, enjoy those movies. And again, that's the point where Star Trek fans who maybe don't like those movies are like, yeah, but that's the point. See, that shows that they're not really Star Trek. And I don't agree with that. I think that Star Trek should be accessible. I think that Star Trek should be welcoming. I think that having Star Trek that you can share with people who don't consider themselves Star Trek fans is a good thing and worth encouraging. But I do think that, you know, they were popular outside of fandom, even though you have this kind of attitude on the internet that they're the worst thing ever. I think that you can see their influence on this. I mean, there's a moment in the Vulcan Hello where the Klingons literally weaponize J.J. Abrams' lens flare, where the bridge is lit up so light that they're like, put up the shields are up. It's just so much lens flare kind of coming in. But even things like, say, the introductory sequence. I mean, after Kuvma's big speech, but the sequence where they're on the surface of the planet, which is very transparently lifted from Star Trek Into Darkness. The sequence where Michael Burnham goes exploring the Klingon relic and launches herself off the ship in a spacesuit, which took months to film and lots of prep, and was very consciously something that was built into the pilot from the start. That is, again, something that was lifted from Star Trek Into Darkness. The sequences of Michael Burnham in the brig, again, shot in such a way as to recall Star Trek Into Darkness. Even the individual plot elements, such as the sequence where, you know, Burnham wakes up after discovering that the Klingons are back and runs to the bridge despite being in a state of medical duress, is again a sequence taken from Star Trek 2009, when Kirk does exactly the same thing after Bones has given him that inoculation, and tries to argue that actually the Romulans are back. This is a trap. It's to lure us there. It's exactly the same plot beat there. So there's very much a kind of a heavy influence of the Abrams movies on here, even if this is technically in the prime timeline. And again, that's not unprecedented. You look at Star Trek: The Next Generation. That is very much lifted directly from Star Trek the Motion Picture. The aesthetic is taken from the Star Trek films that were in cinemas and the Star Trek films that were popular with mass audiences, in a way that, the original Star Trek series, the original 79, 80 episodes, were actually conceived, were seen as being kind of a cult kind of phenomenon. The movies kind of lent an aesthetic that was kind of then carried over. And you can see that even with things like the fact that so much of The Next Generation, or so many episodes of The Next Generation, were repurposed as Phase 2 scripts. Episodes like The Child, for example, or Devil's Due. So, I mean, I think that perhaps that might have been a kind of a factor here. This might have been a factor in deciding why Discovery was set at the time period that it was, because it gives you, even though it's technically just a little bit earlier than the Abrams movies, it gives you a way to tie directly into them as well. And so I can kind of see maybe that was a reason why.
Well, I think that just answers the question of the issue that likes of CBS have this problem. They have this problem of they've got people who are staunchly original series. You've got The Next Generation, people who love Deep Space Nine. You've got people who love the movies. And you've also got newcomers who may have only ever seen the J.J. Abrams films. And the difficulty of balancing that element to be able to get the audience that you're after, because you don't necessarily want just the Star Trek fans. You want to be able to open that up and be open to everyone. And like you say, I mean, I would more than happy have as many people as possible see Star Trek in whatever form, because I want the show to live on, and I want the franchise to go on. And I'm not saying if it was just directed purely at, say, the original series fan base, then it wouldn't go on, but it'd be more difficult. And you can talk about that potentially in season 2 when we bring in characters from that arc. And I think that you can also potentially mention that with the likes of Sarek here, that they're bringing in elements through all of the eras and trying to meld them into some sort of melting pot to try and get something that will work, but at the same time not wanting Fuller to go too far.
Yeah.
So then it's nothing like what the original fans wanted, and you're getting this real weird melting pot of everything, really.
Yeah. And I think that's fair. Like, I think that's one of my kind of issues with Discovery, is that it's not entirely committed to what it wants to do. And I think this is more a problem. Well, it becomes a big problem, I think, as you get towards the end of the first season. I really like the first season of Discovery. I think it's bold. I think it's provocative. I think it's trying new things. And I think it's important for Star Trek at this point in its history to be trying new things. I think that, you were entirely right in terms of like bringing in new blood. And I think being willing to reinvent itself is a large part of what makes Star Trek great, is a part that it can be absolutely anything that it wants to be. It can tackle absolutely anything that's happening out there in the world. I think that like one of the problems that I have with, say, the final 2 episodes of the first season is that they become very fan servicey. They become packed with things that you recognize from other Star Trek stories. And then you get into the second season, and the second season is very much like, well, all the bold stuff that we did in the first season that riled up fans. And again, I don't want to turn this into a second season podcast episode. You're going to get to that later on. But things like, to pick an example, making the Klingons look like they used to look because fans didn't like the redesign of them. Taking out the holographic displays because that doesn't fit with the understanding of how technology works in the Star Trek universe. Bringing in old Star Trek characters that you recognize, people like Pike, number 1, and obviously Spock as well. And even beyond that, restructuring the season in such a way that you have more conventional standalone episodes that are built around generic Star Trek principles, like, oh, look, we encountered a strange space alien of the week. Oh, what are the odds? Oh, we're going to a planet, a colony, and there's some sort of weird thing happening that we can use as a metaphor to explore some part of the human condition, but we're going to have to cram that into 45 minutes, so it's going to be like an episode of the first season of Enterprise, but that's okay because that's what Star Trek feels like. And that sort of aspect of feeling very reactionary in kind of how it does that, as opposed to feeling kind of new and exploratory. Because it's worth noting, like, and this is one of the things where you tend to amplify what you hear on the internet and tend to assume that maybe it's overwhelmingly or misrepresented or representative of something that it actually isn't. Where, like, Discovery is very transparently an absolute mess behind the scenes, as you alluded to. And like, as you go through the first season, the second season, you're going to unpack exactly how much of a mess it is behind the season. Trust me, when we talked about Brian Fuller, this is just the surface of how messed up the production has been on the show. But at the same time, despite that, it is also a massive success by absolutely any measure. It costs $8.5 million to make an episode of Discovery. That is almost as much as it costs to make Game of Thrones at its peak, right? If you're investing that much money and you're not seeing a return on the metrics that you expect to, you will start cutting prices then and there. You'll start cutting budgets. You'll start trimming down. More than that, some of the problems that happened behind the scenes, and again, you'll get into this as you go, happened because CBS continued to invest and trust in the show, arguably far more than what was happening behind the scenes should have suggested that they should have. And the reason that you do that is because the show is so successful that you don't want to stop the money train. Again, nobody has published any actual metrics in terms of ratings of these episodes, so it's not as transparent as looking at the Nielsen ratings and calling it a success. But you've had various indications, in the shadowy way that you can get indications from streaming services, that Discovery has been a massive success. CBS All Access subscriptions apparently sold very, very well while it was on. You have stuff like independent metrics looking at social media and determining that while the first season was on, Star Trek Discovery was as popular on social media as Game of Thrones, which is phenomenal. If you were around in 2017, you know how popular Game of Thrones was. But even beyond that, you look at things like, say, Netflix, which was handling the distribution internationally. And not only was it handling the distribution internationally, it was handling the distribution internationally while bankrolling the entire show. The distribution deal with Netflix paid for the entire budget of the show. And Netflix were apparently so satisfied with how that went that, like, according to their own internal metrics, it was the most popular family show on the service that wasn't actually produced in-house by Netflix, which is quite an accomplishment, particularly when Netflix is only distributing it internationally. So I think that, like, if you are assessing Discovery, like, by those metrics, and again, there's an argument to be made about its quality and its creative decisions, the choices it makes, but, like, in terms of what CBS wanted it to do as a brand or franchise extension, and we can argue whether that's an ideal that Star Trek should live up to, it seemed to accomplish that. And even more colloquially, though, like, even more kind of, like, just anecdotally, I noticed that people who would not have watched a lot of Voyager and Enterprise were watching Discovery. My family watched the first season of Discovery, despite not watching Star Trek regularly since The Next Generation was on. People at work who couldn't recognize a character from Deep Space Nine or Voyager to save their lives, but know who Jean-Luc Picard is, were watching Discovery. That sort of stuff was happening. And I think that, even if you look at the press coverage that it was generating a lot of think pieces in terms of places like The Hollywood Reporter, places like Variety, places like Vulture, websites that, wouldn't, even if, so those that were around while Enterprise was on the air weren't covering it regularly. And it was kind of interesting to see Star Trek grabbed the zeitgeist attention. I think maybe that's waned in the second season. I don't have any real metrics for it. It doesn't feel as vibrant as it was running through the entire first season, including the split, the split in the second half. But I think that you can say that, Star Trek Discovery did bring new life to the franchise. And arguably, I mean, if you want to be entirely frank about it, if you look at the debates that are happening on Twitter, and if you look at the arguments that are happening on YouTube, and I don't think those arguments are representative in terms of, I think there are plenty of old Star Trek fans who really enjoy Discovery. But what's interesting is that for all that you have this kind of attempt to establish a myth that real Star Trek fans are uncomfortable with Discovery or Picard, or they don't respect Picard or Discovery, what you see rising against that is you see an audience of young people who are coming to Star Trek through Discovery. And again, obviously this is all social media. It's just a vocal minority. You can't extrapolate anything from that. But it does suggest that, maybe Discovery has done something to kind of broaden the franchise and to reach a new audience. I'm actually kind of curious in terms of listeners to this podcast, actually, and this is probably something for the Facebook group, but in terms of, are there people who came to Star Trek through Discovery, who came to Star Trek through this distinct vision of Star Trek? Or were you all fans before you came here? Had you all watched Deep Space Nine or Voyager? Or maybe had some of you watched The Next Generation in syndication and then kind of come to Discovery through that? That'd be kind of an interesting thing to unpack, I think.
Yeah, it certainly will be, and I'm sure that when this does go out to air, if we'll probably put that into the group and just see where people are coming from there. Because I agree, I think this is one of the reasons why I was saying I think that where they're aiming it at, that you need to broaden that canvas. There will be people coming through it, but yeah, having Discovery be a gateway to the Star Trek universe, I've got absolutely no doubt that will be the case. At least in the Twitter sphere that you might have seen, or as I say, in the group. So yeah, but definitely worth it. Interesting comments to make in the group, and we'll see if anyone does do that. So we are here today. I know we're half an hour in, but we are
sorry.
No, that's good. That's great stuff. But we need to dive in further into these episodes. We are going to look at both the Vulcan Hello and the Battle of Binary Stars. The story was by Brian Fuller and Alex Kurtzman even. And the teleplay was by Akiva Goldsman and Brian Fuller for the first one. And the Battle of Binary Stars was by Brian Fuller. And the teleplay was by Gretchen Berg and Aaron Harbert, both people that we've mentioned earlier. It was directed by David Semmel and Adam Kane, respectively. And this saw the Shenzhou come into play. And it's very much a epilogue. So we'll dive deeper into this episode right now. Right, okay, so this is very much an epilogue, a prologue, sorry, not an epilogue.
Well, it is an epilogue after a fashion, I think. We'll talk about that in a second, but yeah.
To the show, so we don't even see Discovery. There's a big run, I think it was at New York Comic Con, maybe San Diego, where they showed and this is another thing about going to fan service, where they showed the ship for the first time, and there was quite a lot of reviews on this, and we've seen this recently with Sonic the Hedgehog, for example, where the people have made adjustments based on what people have said from the brief view of what you've seen. But we don't see Discovery in this whatsoever. The actual episode the TV show is called Star Trek Discovery, but we're very much seeing a very singular story and what happened to Michael Burnham and what position she's in by the end of it. What did you think to the way that they approached this from that angle, that this is effectively we don't really get to episode 3 before we see Discovery and the actual pilot itself for the show?
Yeah, this is where I make what might be described in internet terms as a hot take, which is that I actually think that the pilot to Discovery is the strongest Star Trek pilot. Now, to be fair, it's not necessarily a particularly strong pool of talent, despite how much I love The Next Generation, I love Deep Space Nine, and I think Emissary is great, and I really like The Cage as well. But I think that, like, one of the things about the Vulcan Hello and Battle of the Binary Stars is that they are a very, very strong statement of purpose from the show. It's a very full-throated expression of this is what we're doing, this is how we're doing it, and this is why we're doing it as well, which is something that I think maybe gets lost a little bit as the show goes on. And you described it as a prologue. It definitely is a prologue. It kind of sets up this idea that's going to play out across the rest of the season, which is the idea of Burnham feeling responsible for the destruction of the Shenzhou and also the death of Captain Philippa Georgiou as well. But it's very much also an epilogue. And it is an epilogue to the entire Berman era of Star Trek, and very, very pointedly so. And again, there's this sense of... And again, this is one of the things where this is like what the discussion over, let's call it the Kurtzman or the Goldsman era of Star Trek is, which is the question of why can't things be like they were at the peak of Star Trek in the 90s, during the time that The Next Generation and Voyager and, to a lesser extent Deep Space Nine and Enterprise were on the air. Because, that's a kind of... that classic remark that the golden age of science fiction is 12. But if you come up with a classic iteration of a franchise, you tend to internalize that as the ideal of the franchise. You tend to assume that all Star Trek should look like The Next Generation, when in fact The Next Generation looked very little like the original Star Trek. I mean, even in terms of themes and its utopianism and its worldview, it was radically different from a lot of what you saw in the first two seasons of the original Star Trek. But for a generation of people, particularly people who had grown up, whether they've been watching the shows live as they aired, or during the gap, the 12-year gap between the end of Enterprise and the present day, when they were streaming on Netflix and apparently getting something like 5 million streams, each series getting 5 million streams a season or a year, which is a remarkable kind of turnaround for the show. But like, over that time, there was a sense of what Star Trek is kind of becoming set in stone. And the idea was that it would probably look a bit like Star Trek The Next Generation. It would probably look a bit like the Berman era. And what I really... And again, you can see that even in the final seasons of Enterprise, as Enterprise dies down, as the ratings were falling, as nobody was watching, as cancellation loomed. It's very telling that the final episode of Enterprise, the last episode of Star Trek to air on television before the Vulcan Hello, which was the classic kind of these are the voyages, the last episode of Enterprise, the famously maligned and perhaps deservedly maligned, although I tend to cut Braga and Berman a bit more slack in terms of what they were trying to do rather than what they actually accomplished. But even that framed the entire 16-year history of the Berman era as nothing but an extension of The Next Generation. The entirety of Enterprise suggested that it could, if you wanted to read it that way, could be a holodeck fantasy run by William T. Riker. It wasn't meant to be, but you could read it that way if you wanted to. And it's very clear going into the Vulcan Hello that Fuller understands that this is the context in which we're operating. It's very, very clear that as much as the show borrows visually from, the movies that we talked about, the Abrams movies that we talked about, in terms of kind of setup, the Shenzhou is meant to represent Berman era Star Trek, and you have that filter through in any number of ways. Most obviously, there's the captain who has a French surname, Picard, Georgiou, who is a respected diplomat. She's very level-headed, very even kind of handed, very kind of studious, very careful in her judgments, again, very much like Picard is characterized. However, she is not played by a French woman in much the same way that Picard was not played by a French man. Instead, she's played by a Malaysian actress, Michelle Yeoh. And again, you have that with Picard, who is played by a Yorkshire actor, Patrick Stewart. Even throughout that, you have the sort of revelation that, she calls her first officer number one, which obviously, while you could consider that an allusion to the Cage, the captain who most frequently called his first officer number one was Jean-Luc Picard. More than that, you also have the understanding that, Burnham has served on the Shenzhou for 7 years. 7 years, again, being the idealized length of a Berman-era television show. Star Trek The Next Generation ran for 7 years. Star Trek Deep Space Nine ran for 7 years. Star Trek Voyager ran for 7 years. Star Trek Enterprise ran for 4 years, but in press beforehand, you had all the cast talking about how they were looking forward to it running 7 years as well. And so you have a sense when you get to the Vulcan Hello that the Shenzhou has basically finished its Star Trek The Next Generation run. It's finished that 7-year run of Berman era kind of adventures, and it's ready for something new. And what I really like about the Vulcan Hello and Battle of the Binary Stars is that it's very explicitly about tearing through, ripping apart and tearing asunder that idea of the Berman era, that idea that you can go back and you can recreate the Star Trek that was popular on television, in the late 80s and into the early 90s, because this is a very different time now. That narrative logic doesn't hold anymore. And you can say any number of reasons why it doesn't. You can say that it's just how we tell stories now in the era of serialization and streaming, and therefore the episodic adventures of the Shenzhou could never work on television, because that's not how television series are structured these days. You could also go broader, and you could say that, Star Trek The Next Generation was the product of the end of the Cold War, the end of history, this idea of the utopian fantasy of the unipolar moment, the moment at which the economy was booming. There were no major foreign wars, despite sort of interventions in Eastern Europe and places like Haiti. And, there was a sense of like people having liberal democracy having triumphed over everything, and The Next Generation kind of speaking to that. And that simply wasn't viable in the context of a show that was produced in 2016 and airing in 2017. And so you needed to dismantle that in order to tell the story that Star Trek needed to tell at that moment in time. And I kind of admire how ruthless and how brutal the Vulcan Hello and Battle of the Binary Stars are in doing that. In a sense of kind of taking the Star Trek that you recognize and basically pushing you as an audience member and confronting you with the fact that maybe this isn't what Star Trek can be anymore, or this isn't what Star Trek should be anymore, or if Star Trek is going to engage with the present, or it's going to reflect the world in which we live, it needs to move past a model that was arguably well outdated by the time the show wound down in 2005.
Yeah, I mean, you've only got to look at the teaser as well, because the teaser deals with General Order 1 or the Prime Directive, and that's something that was very prevalent in both the original series and Star Trek: The Next Generation. And this also, if you look at this from a JJ perspective as well, it's very similar to Into Darkness. Yeah. As well, with the the rescue in the volcano as well, which is very reminiscent of that as well. That the way that the teaser and the first parts of Michael's journey with Georgiou is they try to relate on the ship that they have lived together for those 7 years. They try and use little off the cuff remarks that Georgiou says to the ensign and or the lieutenant or whoever that may be. I can't remember exactly who he was. Yeah. It was Connor, but I can't remember what.
He's Ops.
He's Ops. Yeah.
Ops. He's the Harry Kim basically, and he gets properly deadlocked.
Well, yes, he does. He gets. Well, let's wait till we get there.
Yeah.
But yeah, so, and you've got these creatures on there that we're trying to, they're trying to change their path. And where does the Prime Directive come from that? Because is the Prime Directive only for sentient life that have grew to develop to a certain level, or does the Prime Directive affect everything they do? Because they are effectively changing the way of that world. So that would be my first question, just purely on a Next Generation type question, that you can imagine after this they would go up and talk about that in like Picard does in the Quarters. I think is it Homewood that he does that in, where they have a massive conversation. Oh no, it's the one where Data's got the kid. Can't remember which episode.
Oh, Pen Pals. With,
yes.
Skyenko, isn't it? Shrinkless.
Yeah, where he receives the radio signals from her, and it's a direct
cry in the dark.
Yeah, exactly. And whether or not and they have this huge debate with Picard and Riker and. No, it wasn't Beverly, was it? It was second season, so it would be
Pulaski,
yeah. So they have and Worf's even involved in that conversation. But yeah, so you do have that feel to it. I mean, you mentioned that is very much, as I say, that is very much Next Generation, isn't it? The way that they've actually brought that in, and they try and even like the Saru and Michael thing, where they're trying to knock each other off and they don't like each other kind of thing. They're kind of working,
but they still work together. Yeah, they don't like each other, but they still work together, sort of thing. And again, they're like you mentioned the introduction. I actually think that sequence is quite important in differentiating Discovery from the Next Generation. I am not a huge fan of kind of the angst of, Next Generation or original series or, arguably even Star Trek Enterprise Prime Directive stories, which are, in many cases, if you want to be flippant about it, can come down to, gee, it's really hard watching all these innocent people die. Sort of like the kind of that angst, that almost kind of like Rudyard Kipling kind of white man's burden. I know that they're set up to be like, well, we don't want to interfere directly in these civilizations and we don't want that to have any unintended consequences. But there's in certain aspects or in certain episodes of The Next Generation, it tends to come across a lot more in terms of justifying letting people die because you don't want to feel guilty if there are consequences that make you feel bad if you help. And actually, this is one of the things that I think that say Star Trek Deep Space Nine actually does really well. Star Trek Deep Space Nine never really does a Prime Directive episode, and I think that's quite deliberate and I think that's quite pointed, because it happens, like there's an episode very early on, Battle Lines, where Cisco lands on a moon full of people who have been reliving the same war over and over again, and whenever they die horrible, brutal, painful deaths, they're resurrected so they can continue fighting and killing each other according to the punishment that was bestowed upon them. And Cisco's like, this is monstrous. We have to get these people out of here. And Bashir, who is the representative of the Next Generation, Bashir on Deep Space Nine is the character who speaks for the Roddenberry-esque kind of virtues of the original Star Trek and the Next Generation, and this kind of idealism and this very idea that like Starfleet is always right and the Federation, is the right way of doing things, and this kind of humanism and optimism. And, again, not to turn this into the Bashir podcast, but it's absolutely fascinating how they use Bashir on Deep Space Nine. But in that episode, Bashir says to Cisco, but what about the Prime Directive? And Cisco is like, what? Like, these people are suffering and dying and we can help them. Why wouldn't we do that? Under what logic would we get up in our runabout and leave these people to continue torturing each other for eternity? And to be fair to the Vulcan Hello, having rewatched it twice for this podcast, it's very clear that the reason why the civilization is under threat in this particular scenario isn't actually a natural disaster. It's a meteor drilling accident that caused a radiation surge that wiped out the water table. So there's actually a sense of acknowledging that kind of these sort of civilization-ending threats often themselves, they don't necessarily always happen due to natural disasters. They often happen as a consequence or an unintended consequence of kind of a ripple effect of stuff that's happening elsewhere. And so there is a sense of responsibility and a sense in which we're all kind of tied together. And again, this is something that I actually really like about the Vulcan Hello and, some of Discovery as it goes on as well, is that it takes some of the core assumptions of Star Trek and sort of ideas that, the franchise has embraced, and which were very good and very thoughtful at the time. Again, the Prime Directive is a great idea on paper because it forces you to evaluate the idea of accidental imperialism, or the idea of kind of maybe accidentally manipulating a culture to serve your own interests. It's very much about protecting, in its idealized form, the Prime Directive is about protecting other cultures from your interference. But exploring maybe the ways in which the core assumptions of Star Trek sometimes haven't been properly interrogated by the shows. And to pick a small example, not to jump too far ahead, but there's a sequence where, Brett Anderson, Admiral Brett Anderson, who is a fascinating character for all that he appears of 5 minutes in this episode, in this two-parter, Anderson shows up and he's having this conversation with Georgiou, and Burnham walks in, and Burnham's like, Klingons are a warrior culture, and he's like, hey, let's not be racist. Let's not make racist generalizations. And she's like, no, there's a difference between
racism
race and culture. And again, that's something that, maybe I think Star Trek has always understood, but has never quite articulated in a way that is as clear and as thoughtful as Burnham's simple one-line rebuttal to Anderson's logic there. And there's a sense of, I think there's a lot of that in the Vulcan Hello happening very subtly. And I think that small detail of the water table not being annihilated by, a volcano eruption or a freak meteor storm, but instead being a consequence of a meteor drilling accident, kind of gets at that. It gets at the sense in which everything is connected to one another. And I mean, we're going to talk about the Klingons in a moment. That is another example. The Klingons and the motivation that the Vulcan Hello gives to the Klingons in terms of why T'Kuvma is doing what he's doing. It's also a very clever interrogation of certain assumptions that the franchise has had for a very long time, but never expressly articulated, I think.
Yeah, well, this is something that I was going to bring up anyway, but we will get into the Klingons and we'll delve quite deeply into them and their culture and things. But I'm just thinking on Star Trek as a whole, we see that within this, we're talking about race versus culture, and the two very different things. And in Star Trek Picard, we talk about the Romulans, and they sort of talk about the Romulans being from the north, and you've got the Zapfash, and you've got the Romulan themselves, and you've got all these cultures, that the Romulan cultures being spread out, and they're all very different, and it alludes to another new Romulan culture that's building upwards. But that's something that personally, I don't feel that Star Trek has done over the history of things. The Klingons were very much the Klingons, and
monolithic,
and they were very monolithic. And then you've got the Romulans being who they are, and you've got the Cardassians being that race, and there being an allegory for this. But what I think that they're trying to do with the new era Star Trek is to give them more depth than that. To actually, you've got the 24 houses of the Klingons and Romulans. You do have the Zapfash in there, and you do have people from the north and things. And it's not just a case of the Romulan, the Vulcan, the Romulans, the Vulcans, the Klingons. The Klingons are the baddies. They're you're evil, you're Nazis or whatever. It's kind of a little more nuanced than that.
And I mean, to be fair, to give Star Trek kind of some credit in that sense, I think this is something where Enterprise in particular doesn't get enough credit, because Enterprise is very much a springboard into Discovery. Yeah. And again, you could argue that Discovery is arguably as much a sequel series to Enterprise as it is a prequel to the original series. But you could see even in... And again, Deep Space Nine did some stuff around that as well, where I think that one of the interesting things it did with the Cardassians was it made sure that they were all distinct and they all had distinct personalities, as opposed to, say, and again, I love the Next Generation, I'm not disparaging the Next Generation, but the Next Generation where you had Romulan Commander of the Week, is it Tomalak or is it exactly the same character played by a different actor?
Oh yeah, that's my point, exactly. Yeah.
But I do think that you did see a little bit of it as you got towards the end of the Berman era, where I think that Deep Space Nine differentiated its Klingon characters and its Cardassian characters well enough, and kind of provided a different sense of context or where they came from. And I think that even Enterprise, which Enterprise has Judgment, which is I think the second season of Enterprise is a huge mess of a season of television. It is, frankly, the season of Star Trek that made me give up on the franchise when I was in college. But I think that it does have a couple of spectacular episodes. And I think that Judgment is one of those, because it finally answers the question, what about Klingon lawyers? And again, you have, even later on in the final season, where you have Divergence and Affliction. You have this, or Affliction and Divergence. I can't remember the order in which those two parters aired. But you have that episode, which is what about the Klingon scientists as well? Which are, again, questions fans and novelists and sort of tie-in fiction had been asking for ages and ages and ages. But which had never really been interrogated by the show before. Which is what if you have a character who doesn't conform to their expectations? I mean, you could argue that Nog did the same thing on Deep Space Nine, where he was a Ferengi who didn't want to turn prophet, or Rom as well. And you could see the show kind of leaning in that direction there as well. I think that Discovery just kind of takes that springboard and kind of jumps off it in a much bolder kind of way, in a kind of a much more aggressive way, I think.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked briefly about Georgiou. I mean, what did you make to her as a character? Unfortunately, we do lose out at the end of these two episodes, which is a shame. And then we as we get into later into the season, we kind of have other issues to deal with Georgiou. But what did you make to her portrayal here, and how she's used, especially with likes of saying why Sarek chose her? And you can talk about Sarek a little bit as well, why he was brought in. Obviously, we don't really get mention of Spock here, but people who know Sarek is will automatically know that. But the way she says, you were brought to me because I still choose hope over having seeing loss of life, and this is a real pertinent question that Michael actually has, because she makes the decision to attack, and where Georgiou wouldn't have done that. So what did you make to her portrayal over the two episodes?
Well, Georgiou is interesting because she's very transparently meant to be your classic Star Trek captain. She's very clearly meant to be Picard. And again, you have that idea, it's the I was a human who'd seen a life of loss, but still chose hope, which again is something very similar to the classic Star Trek arc. It's very much the case with Picard, who's, endured things like, assimilation, but even the death of his family in generations. Stuff like, for example, Sisko, who witnessed the loss of his wife, and then rebuilt a life for himself on Deep Space Nine, and continued to believe, in Federation ideals, even if he came to, to a certain extent question what Starfleet was actually capable of doing at certain points over the course of the show. And you have that sense of Georgiou kind of representing that within the episode, where she's very clearly arguing that no, we will follow standard Federation procedures. Starfleet doesn't fire first is very much kind of her insistence. And she's a representation of those ideals and those virtues. And again, this is the thing where you get to Burnham and you get to that conflict that exists. And again, this is one of those things that I find interesting about Discovery, and why I think Discovery is kind of notable as a Brian Fuller kind of production, which is that a large part of what Discovery does is that it shifts attention away from the captain. Obviously, Michael Burnham is the main character here. She's the first officer on the Shenzhou, but she later becomes a convict and then becomes a specialist working on Discovery herself, and the show is told from her perspective. But more than that, you have this kind of sense of Discovery being a show that's interested in marginalized perspectives. So, notably, it's the first Star Trek series to feature an explicitly gay regular character. Which shouldn't, there's no excuse for that in the history of the Star Trek franchise. There's absolutely no excuse why it took as long as it did to get characters like Stamets to actually appear in the title credits of the show. And it, again, that's a huge black mark on the Berman era. And Fuller's very transparently pushing that forward. And again, he's talked about that. He's talked about how important it was for him as a gay man who grew up loving Star Trek to have that representation on there as well. But even small things, like, you notice that kind of Tilly has the kind of, she's not necessarily, Mary Wiseman isn't necessarily the classic kind of Hollywood kind of physique of kind of a leading female actor, for example. And you have Burnham herself, and this is kind of interesting. And this is where I think what Discovery's doing gets very interesting, which is that Star Trek fans have generally we've grown up expecting allegory, and we've grown up expecting a level of what the show is saying to be concealed behind a science fiction trapping. So, when the show is dealing with things like racism, it does it with, Let That Be Your Last Battlefield, where aliens are half black and half white, but on opposite sides of their faces, in order to show us how ridiculous racism is. Or when it's dealing with the legacy of slavery, it does it through episodes like The Measure of a Man, where Data is a robot that's been built by humans, and therefore becomes an exploration of kind of how we treat disposable people and stuff like that. And that's very important. And it's huge. It's a huge part of what I love about Star Trek, and what a lot of people love about Star Trek. It's worth noting that this doesn't always work as well as you might expect. There are plenty of episodes and plenty of examples and plenty of even entire seasons of the show where these allegories kind of backfire because they're not particularly well thought through. I'm thinking, say, of the Kazon arc on Voyager, which is just a horrible mess. It's meant to be an allegory for gang violence, but it ends up becoming a weird argument where Janeway sits down and drinks champagne with former slavers because they're her kind of people, in one of the most ill-judged episodes of Star Trek ever made. What I think is interesting about Discovery is that it takes these themes and this allegorical approach, and it grounds it in something that is a lot more raw and a lot closer to our understanding of these ideas and these issues. And it's particularly obvious with Burnham. And again, it's that conversation with Brett Anderson, again, fascinating character in the context of this pilot, who kind of shows up and gives this lecture to, he's like, I think you'd know the difference between, not to judge I think you know better than to judge a race like that, particularly given your background, he says, turning to her and looking at her. And in the context of the show, we're meant to interpret that as Burnham is a human character who has grown up surrounded by Vulcans. And therefore, that's what he means when he talks about her background informing judging people based on race. However, the show is also very pointedly having a white man turn around to a black woman and say, oh, don't you should know about racism because of who you are. And that is deliberately and pointedly uncomfortable. And the show does that repeatedly. And you have it like, it's very clear with, say, Burnham's hairstyle, right? Where Burnham, when she's working on the Shenzhou, when she's as Sarek's kind of adopted daughter, you'll notice that her hair is straightened. And again, in the world of the show, that's because she's a Vulcan. And Vulcans and Romulans have always had these very straightened wigs on their head. And that's how their hair look. However, again, in the context of looking at this, in the context of where we are now as a culture in 2017, it's a black woman who is straightening her hair, who is disguising her blackness. And it's notable that as the show goes on, later on in the season, Burnham stops straightening her hair and starts letting her hair grow naturally, like Sonique Martin Green's natural hair kind of design. And again, there's that sense of she's fitting in. She's repressing who she is to fit into this space. And in the context of the show, it's a human fitting into a Vulcan space. However, at the same time, when you're watching those episodes, it's very clearly a black woman fitting in a space that is, dominated by somebody like Brett Anderson. He is the leader of Starfleet in the
He's like
era.
an alpha male white man, isn't he, really? So.
He is, and kind of like but not necessarily like a reactionary white man. He's a very he's a liberal. He's an ideal kind of liberal. He would describe himself as colorblind, is basically how he would position himself. And it's notable that one of the core themes of the Vulcan Hello, and again, it's something that is very, very timely in 2017, is this idea of taking concerns seriously when they come from people with experience of oppression and violence. So you have Michael Burnham arriving on the bridge and saying, the Klingons are here. This is a problem. This is a major situation. We need to be very, very worried about what's going to happen now. And you have people who do not have her lived experience, people who have, not had the encounters that she has, who have not necessarily lived the life that she has, who have not kind of moved through the circles that she has moved through, saying, no, it's grand. This is nothing to worry. It'll be fine. Don't worry about it. It'll be grand. And as a result, she ends up increasingly characterized because she's had to button down, because she's had to kind of strip away, because she's had to act so cold and rational. And again, this is the thing where in the world of the show, she's a human presenting as a Vulcan. But in the context of talking to people I know and talking to people, I would consider friends, a large part of kind of what they see when they look at Burnham is they see a black person who is afraid of being characterized as an angry black man because they voice their concerns in a way that is emotive, or a woman who is afraid of being seen as being hysterical because she voices her concerns in a legitimate way, in a way that is legitimate to her, but which doesn't fit in the framing of kind of this idea of, well, hey, look, everybody be calm and kind of like everybody settle down and everything will be fine. And this is very much kind of pointed in the context of, Star Trek Discovery as a show that was produced in 2016 and airing in 2017. Because, again, you had this idea of, well, the election of Donald Trump happening in the States and things like Brexit happening in the UK, where you had these voices of people who were saying, no, this is serious. This is real. This is something that is really happening. This man rode down a gold escalator and called Mexican immigrants rapists. And he's going to run for the most powerful office in the country, and he might actually get there. And he may end up the most powerful man in the world. And you had people like the Brett Andersons of this world turning around and going, no, look, you calm down. It's not going to happen. It'll be fine. It'll play himself out. Just ignore it. It'll be fine. Or, people saying, hey, no, these policies are terrifying and racist, and they're going to have horrible implications. They're going to, it's going to lead to crackdowns. It's going to lead to, children in cages. It's going to lead to people dying. And like everybody's saying, no, calm down. You're overreacting. Look, even if he gets elected, there's going to be mechanisms in place that will keep everything sane and sound and reasonable. You need to calm down. You're scaring people with this rhetoric. It's making people uncomfortable. And there's a real sense of that kind of playing through kind of the episode as it goes, where you have Burnham, who has spent so long practicing to fit in this space, practicing to seem rational, practicing to seem like she has no emotional response to anything, that when she's confronted with this gigantic existential threat, she basically melts down because she's never had to find a forum to express herself emotionally in a way that's comfortable or a way that, is accepted by other people. And it ends up just becoming this gigantic mess that just kind of bubbles over. And I think that's actually quite brilliant. And I think that does make some people watching Discovery very uncomfortable because it's a lot more literal than the franchise has tended to be in the past. It's a lot more direct than the franchise has been in the past. In terms of, to pick an obvious example, like if you're using Data as an allegory for minority experience, Data is literally painted white and played by a white actor, played by Brent Spiner. So, you don't have the discomfort of having an African-American actor on screen going through this and kind of doing this and having to kind of parse what it means for her to straighten her hair in a way that we do in the modern world. And I think that's a very deliberate choice on the part of Fuller, to give credit where credit's due. I think he knows exactly what he's doing, because there's a tendency, and again, I say this as somebody who absolutely loves The Next Generation and who absolutely loves Deep Space Nine and who has a lot of affection for the Star Trek franchise as a whole. There's a tendency when Star Trek does its allegories, in the way that I described at the start, in the way that, it's like, oh, there's a half black, half white person. Isn't it ridiculous that anybody is racist wherever? Where that tends to obscure some of the more subtle and unsettling aspects of actual kind of like systemic racism, because it reduces racism to, this sort of carnival effect where it's like, surely everybody can see how stupid this is, and it clearly doesn't reflect the situation as it stands right now, as opposed to what Discovery does when it puts Sonique Martin Green in that situation. And as an audience member, you're forced to go, well, actually, yeah, do I know anybody who has, had to straighten their hair in order to feel more comfortable around me? Do I know somebody who has to be very careful about how they the tone they use when they express how comfortable or uncomfortable they are speaking to me about something that clearly worries them? And I think that that's very timely. I think it's very relevant. And I think I really admire that Discovery kind of went there, and it went there so strong.
We go back into her history as well to really prove that point in some ways. I mean, we go back to where Spock, again, J.J. Abrams' kind of viewpoint when we go to the history of what happened to her. And we'll mention about the Klingon change in the fact that the terrorist attacks, things that's mentioned in there. But we do see Burnham's arc through those kind of three stages that we see her in, that we see her as a child, as a PTSD child in a lot of ways, that we see her as she's progressing and learning and being mentored by Georgiou. But then we also see her on top of that, resisting and finding her emotional aspect to what she is and how she manages to come up against authority, but she's doing it for the right reasons, and in some ways a very logical reasoning.
That's kind of interesting though, because again, this is one of the things that I really find interesting about the Vulcan Hello and Battle of the Binary Stars, which is the question of how right we are supposed to assume that Burnham is. I mean, I would argue that over the course of the first season, Burnham's journey, and again, this is something we actually talked about a little bit when we talked about the Picard finale, but Burnham's journey is about reconciling the rational and emotional sides of herself into a complete whole. And again, you see that in the fact that, she falls in love over the course of the season, but even the fact that she ends up kind of, forming a friendship with Tilly and actually like dancing and smiling and going to that party, in kind of, was it Magic to Make the Sanest Man Go Mad, for example, where you have this idea that like, she learns to be a human being and to accept that how she feels about things emotionally kind of matter to her. And again, like you have that. And again, this is one of the things where how Discovery tells its story is fundamentally different to how The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager told their stories, which is that, its allegories tend to be more personal than social. So you have the obvious example of the sarcophagus ship, right? Which is this very weird concept of the Klingons, like, entombing their dead literally on the hull of their ship, where Saru describes it as armor, but very ineffective armor. But the whole point is that, like, that detail doesn't exist to tell you a lot about the Klingons as a culture. It's not necessarily something that you're designed to kind of note down and go, well, this makes sense in terms of like the logic of the universe. Instead, it's meant to make you think, oh, wait, that's exactly what Michael Burnham does as a character. She is the sarcophagus ship. She has wrapped the dead around her and carried them with her. The dead being her family, obviously, from the Klingon attack. Maybe the people who were also killed at the bombing of the Logic Center. And then, obviously, after this two-parter, most of the crew of the Shenzhou, but also particularly Georgiou. And one of the things that I really like about the first season of Discovery as a whole is that its character arc is built as much on sort of emotion as it is on logic, in that. And again, you're going to talk about Mira Georgiou later in the season, and you're going to talk about, then there's a lot to unpack there, and I'm not going to get into that. But Burnham's arc basically culminates in the idea that she gets a second chance to save Georgiou. That's it. Like, that's her character arc, is reaching a point where she maybe realizes that she couldn't save Georgiou, but she can save a version or a stand-in or a surrogate for Georgiou, and accepting that even though that doesn't undo the horrible thing that happened and how bad she feels about that, it also allows her to maybe let go of the grief, and it becomes this kind of symbolic thing. And I think that, like, when we talk about, like, what Burnham does in the Vulcan Hello, her attempted mutiny, I don't think that we are meant to be on Burnham's side in that. I think that we are meant to look at that and go, that's a situation that's making the situation worse. What Burnham does escalates the situation that was going to escalate anyway. Like, it was very clear that T'Kuvma wanted a war, and he was going to get a war anyway. And it's very clear, like, Sarek makes it clear when he's talking to her. He says, don't assume that what worked for the Vulcans is going to work for you, because the Klingons are acting uncharacteristically. You yourself have defined what's happening now as uncharacteristic of Klingon behavior. Don't assume that if you act in the way that the Vulcans have, that the Klingons will respond in the way that they did to the Vulcans. And you have this kind of paradox where, because Burnham has been kind of taught to process things rationally, she ends up kind of filtering her emotions through logic and kind of breaking both of them so they don't quite match. Like, there's a really, really wonderful moment. And again, this kind of speaks to that storytelling that Discovery does that no other Star Trek has really done to this point. But, like, you have the recurring motif in the Vulcan Hello and Battle of the Binary Stars of characters lying to themselves and to the audience. Star Trek has always been, and again, this is something, it's not just Star Trek, traditionally network television has always been very cautious about having characters lie, because audiences accept what characters say at face value.
Yeah.
And typically, if characters lie, you will immediately have other characters go, that character's lying. And again, like, I love Deep Space Nine, but even Deep Space Nine was capable of doing this. So think of, for example, the episode Waltz, which is the episode in which Sisko and Dukat get stranded on a planet together, right? Over the course of Deep Space Nine, the show built up this idea of Gul Dukat as a character who was a monster, but he was a very self-rationalizing monster. He was a very complex character. He was drawn remarkably well. Wonderful performance from Mark Alamo. And over the course of the show, it's always clear that he was basically the Cardassian Adolf Hitler. He oversaw a genocide that led to the death of millions of Bajorans on the surface of Bajor. But he was very good at rationalizing to himself why he did that. And he was very good at articulating his viewpoints, like, in a way that made them seem almost sane if you didn't remind yourself that he killed millions and millions of people. However, the show still felt the need, in the episode Waltz, to make it clear that Dukat was, and I quote Sisko in the closing scene of the episode, truly evil. Because it couldn't trust the audience to look at what Dukat was saying, look at how he was behaving, see the gap that exists between the two, and understand that what Dukat actually is a bad man who is very good at rationalizing to himself. And what's interesting about Discovery is that Discovery kind of borrows something from peak television. And you saw it a lot in, say, Breaking Bad, where Walter White would repeatedly explain why he was doing things, but it would be immediately clear to the audience that why he said he was doing things was not actually why he was doing things. And again, arguably, you have the show Breaking Bad even conceding that didn't work, because you have the big phone call to Skylar White in, I think, Ozymandias, where he explains, no, I actually did it for me. He actually spells out everything the show had been making clear in subtext. And so you have in the Vulcan Hello, you have Burnham insisting that she's acting logically, even though absolutely everything in the episode kind of pushes, against that. You have her saying, when Georgiou says, no, you're responding to that trauma that you experienced at the hands of the Klingons, she says, this isn't about what happened, this is about what's happening now. And it's very clear that no, it's not. She's just never processed what happened, and this is her reliving it. But there's also a moment, and it's one of those great moments. I kind of laugh out loud every time I hear it, because it's that really black Brian Fuller humor, where it's, my reaction to this is not emotional. We target its neck and cut off its head.
Yeah,
and it's like
in such a way, yeah.
Yeah, and again, great performance from Sonique Martin-Green there as well. But again, it's very clear that you're not meant to take what Burnham's saying at face value. And it happens with Surik as well in Battle of the Binary Stars, where he says, like, I would not risk my life on trite sentimentality when he visits her as she's dying. And it's like, no, Sarek, you very clearly are doing that. It's the same thing that, like, and again, that's an example of borrowing something from the Abrams movies, where, like, in Star Trek 2009, Spock, asks, well, why did you marry Amanda? And Sarek has always said it seemed the logical thing to do. Except Sarek then literally at the climax of the movie has to spell out to Spock, no, you moron. That's not why I married her. I married her because I loved her. And you have that kind of sense running through Discovery where the characters, aren't always being truthful to themselves, and the show trusting the audience to understand that. So you have this idea of, despite the fact that Burnham is arguing that her response to the Klingon attack is logical and rational because it follows the precedent that was set by the Vulcans. Interesting side note, by the way, the Vulcan Hello originated 140 years before the episode, 240 years before the episode, which is set in 2256, which means, by the way, the Vulcan Hello originated in 2016. Take of that what you will.
Okay.
But it's notable that she tries to apply that to the situation. She tries to make logic bend to fit her worldview. And again, this happens throughout the show. The logic extremists in the episode Leave, for example, are very clearly bending logic to reach conclusions that they'd already determined. And again, I think this is something that is very pointed in the context of Discovery being a 2016-2017 show, because you had the emergence of the neo-reactionary movement. You had the emergence of kind of this, the alt-right, where rationality was a large part of the logic of the alt-right, where it was very much like, we don't respond to, this stuff with emotion, we respond with facts. And the facts clearly back up our political position, which is that, we should, not allow immigrants into the country, and they're destroying our culture, and all this sort of stuff, which is very clearly highly charged emotional stuff. And if you look at the videos of people at those movements, it's very clear that despite the fact they might call themselves rationalists, they are not behaving in a way that is rational. They're responding emotionally, but they're couching it in rationalism. And that's very, very dangerous and very, very unsettling and very, very uncomfortable, because it demonstrates the way in which logic bends to emotion, and the way in which logic without a strong morality underpinning it is pointless and empty and kind of dangerous. And I really like that, again, the Star Trek franchise has always been wary of the Vulcans. I mean, going back to episodes like Amok Time, where Spock's wife manipulates him to murder his best friend so she can basically get a divorce and marry the man that she wants to marry. But even say Journey to Babel, where Sarek is hella racist and really rude, but even like throughout to like The Next Generation or Deep Space Nine, where you have episodes where Vulcans are busy bullying Cisco at Starfleet Academy, or murdering people with invisible shotguns, or that sort of stuff.
But even Enterprise as well. I mean, the beginning part of Enterprise is really strong on that, isn't it?
Yeah, really wary of kind of Vulcans as this idea of kind of logic without emotion being something that you should be wary of. And Discovery very much kind of extends that. And it kind of one of the things that it suggests with Burnham's kind of character breakdown is that if you refuse to acknowledge your emotions, if you don't accept your emotions as part of who you are, if you don't embrace them or embrace your emotional response to something as a perfectly valid response to have, what you end up with is something kind of horrible, something that is grotesque and kind of unsettling and disturbing and leads to horrific consequences throughout. And again, like it's not a theme that's particular to Burnham. You see it with, Tyler later on in the season, where Tyler's arc is very much about reconciling all parts of himself, for example, and kind of not distancing or not kind of like locking up this little part of himself away from the rest of him, and the chaos that kind of unfolds from there. And again, you arguably see it even with the motif of magic mushrooms that runs through the season, which is very much about consciousness expansion, and very literally with the character of Stamets, the expert in mushrooms, but who eventually undergoes this kind of deeply personal change as a result of kind of this process of kind of like engaging with magic mushrooms. And again, it's a type of storytelling that is radically different from anything that Star Trek had done before. And I imagine that might be part of the reason why some old-fashioned Star Trek fans were a little bit uneasy with the storytelling on Discovery and the storytelling in Picard later on. But I think it's something that speaks very much to the moment that we're at now culturally. I think it's something that's very important in the context of making a Star Trek show that you're launching in September 2017.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right in a lot of things. I think we'll move into the Klingons in just a second, but I think what you're saying there with Michael is probably a reason why there's quite a lot of vocalization on not liking Michael as a character, but I think it's designed in that way that we need to see what the worst of her is before we can actually see her journey as she goes through from, from the fact that she's been wounded from the very beginning right through to what decisions she makes here, and then what that moves on moving forward.
And again, in the context of Brian Fuller and Brian Fuller's footprints being all over the show, Michael Burnham is Tom Paris. Like, that's literally what she is, except this time you saw what she did. That's the difference between Tom Paris and Michael Burnham. And I think like there's a large part of Discovery which feels like Fuller doing Voyager right in inverted commas, and it's noticeable that you see a lot of overlap between Voyager and between Discovery because Voyager was the Star Trek show that Fuller worked on. But it's absolutely like entirely, I suspect, intentional that Burnham's arc is basically that of Tom Paris.
Yeah, no, I can totally see that. I mean, I know that Tom Paris himself actually was meant to be the character from Next Generation, but there was legal ramifications for that. But yeah, I can totally see that, and it's the fact that we see it on screen. I think it's really it's somewhere that Star Trek would not normally go down. Yeah, Sisko, but when he starts, he's wounded, but he's brought on to Deep Space Nine, and he's getting enlightened to that. They put him in the emissary mode before we get to the Pale Moonlight, for example. So there's a difference there. This is our main character.
And even then, like, the Saratoga destruction is not Sisko's fault in any way, shape, or form. He does the best that he can in that situation. It would be like opening with something like, For the Uniform, where he basically uses, biological weapons and kind of just shrugs it off as a thing that he does. If that was his introductory character moment, it would be very, very jarring, as opposed to he watched his kind of friends and family die. Which kind of gives you a much more sympathetic view. Now, I actually really admire that the show gives Burnham kind of a strong introduction like this. And I think that it is sympathetic to her. I think it's very clear that the episode is, like, understands why she does what she does, even if what she does has horrific consequences. And again, like, to be entirely clear, the thing that Burnham does which has horrific consequences is not actually the attack on the Klingon ship, because it's implied that T'Kuvma was going to attack anyway. And obviously she's stopped from launching the torpedoes and attacking the Klingon ship, which would have just given T'Kuvma the war he wanted anyway. The thing that Burnham does, which leads to the war, and which leads to the situation that basically leads to all the deaths that follow, is actually when her and Georgiou beam to the Klingon ship to capture T'Kuvma. And again, it's Burnham's plan. Notably, it's Burnham's plan to go over to the ship, kidnap T'Kuvma, hold him as hostage, and therefore use that to embarrass the Klingon Empire and defuse the war. It's a very logical solution to the problem, and it makes sense given what we know about the Klingon culture. And indeed, even in the context of Star Trek Discovery, one of the things that the baby Burnham says, during her little sort of Star Trek 2009 kind of Vulcan training sequence is, Klingon culture is driven by an inviolable kind of honor-shame dynamic. And if you shame T'Kuvma, you humiliate him, you disband the threat, and you kind of defuse the Klingon Empire and the Klingon War from the start. And so capturing him was a good idea. The problem is that in the heat of the moment, when T'Kuvma kills Georgiou, when he stabs her and she dies, and it's a split-second decision, it's very much, again, it's Burnham's emotions getting the better of her, and they get the better of her because she's not prepared. She's never had to deal with them before, so she doesn't know how to react to them. In the heat of the moment, she picks up a phaser, which is lit blue, meaning it's set to stun. She manually changes it to red, which means kill, and shoots T'Kuvma, killing him, turning him into a martyr, which she herself had pointed out was exactly the worst case outcome of this scenario. And again, it's that split-second decision, and it happens very quickly, which isn't what typically happens with Star Trek storytelling. Typically, when a big character moment like that happens, it's signposted, or it's deconstructed afterwards, or they have long monologues or conversations, or they'll have a closing scene in the character's quarters where the captain drops by and says, well, I thought about that, and did you know you were doing it? And she'd say something like, I don't know if I knew, and you get a kind of closing shot of her reflection, which kind of spell it out for the audience. But I kind of, Discovery moves quickly enough that sequence, if you're not watching carefully, if you're not paying careful attention to it, you might miss it. You might assume that she picked up a phaser that was set to kill anyway, and didn't make the conscious choice to switch it. And again, I really, really like that aspect of the show. I think that it's a very different style of storytelling than you're used to on Star Trek. But I think it manages to do that thing of keeping Burnham sympathetic, because we all understand that feeling. We've all had that flush of anger. We've all felt that reflexive kind of urge to do something very, very stupid in a situation that is a tinderbox, while also underscoring the stakes and the scope of it, because her bad decision in that split second led to millions and millions of deaths. Or, sorry, led to at least 80,000. What is the death toll, actually, from the Klingon War?
Oh, I don't know. So now you're asking me.
Sorry.
Let's have a look at Memory Alpha. Let's see what they say. Yeah, so 21,000 is the number, I believe. So yeah, so it's quite a lot. But the thing is as well that moment where she changed it to red is a deliberate thing, but she's acting purely on human instinct as well, which is the obviously the battle that she's going to come between is the fact that she made that decision, she's made that mistake, she's got to live with that mistake, and I think that really puts that element into the story really well when moving into what will be effectively the third pilot or the second pilot in episode 3. But we need to talk about the Klingons. So we move into this now, and what I particularly like about the opening scene with this is the speech that's being given. I'll just read it out. I will not read it in Klingonese though.
Oh, shit!
Before you even start with
that's for patrons.
That's for patrons. That's a patron only thing, you know. And so the lines are: they are coming, atom by atom. They will coil around us and take all that we are. There is one way to confront this threat. By reuniting the 24 warring houses of our own empire, we have forgotten the unforgettable. The last to unify our tribes, Kalis, together under one creed, remain Klingon, which is a phrase that gets used and used again, which we'll talk about shortly. That is why we light our beacon this day, to assemble our people, to lock arms against those whose fatal greeting is, we come in peace, which is a complete juxtaposition of where Starfleet and what we expect from Starfleet and the Federation to come from, that they are looking for peace in the world, and and searching out new life and new frontiers and all that kind of thing. But he's effectively using this speech to reverse the very foundation of what the Federation are. So I'm not going to even ask any more questions with this. I just want to what do you think of this iteration of the Klingons from that point of view, and then obviously throughout the 2 episodes?
Well, just that speech, which is absolutely striking. And again, this is one of the things of Star Trek, like Discovery, existing in a context that is radically different from the peak in the 90s. Because, the Federation is transparently, has always been kind of this idea of American values. And it's the idea of American ideals, extrapolated into the future. The final frontier is Kennedy's new frontier, just taken further and kind of pushed to its logical extreme. It's the kind of that idea kind of just pushed forward. And one of the interesting tensions that exists, and again, this is something that you get to when we talked about the Prime Directive earlier, is this idea of the influence of the Federation, and the idea of kind of whether that influence is benign or whether it is corrosive, or whether or not it's possible to survive contact with that idea. And again, this is something that if you watch the kind of 90s Star Trek shows, they're very, very much in conversation about. Like, to pick an example, Voyager is a show that is very wary of some of the multiculturalism of the Star Trek franchise. And I mean, to pick a couple of examples off the top of my head, episodes like Displaced, for example, in which strange aliens start appearing on the ship, replacing the crew one at a time, and basically are revealed to be kind of sinister, plotting to take over the place, which is very hard not to read as an anti-immigration screed these days. Or Day of Honor, for example, in which the crew encounter a bunch of refugees from the Borg who ask for assistance, but who are then revealed to be a bunch of scavengers that you can't trust, who will hold the crew ransom at the first opportunity that they have to do so. And even, like, if you look at, say, individual episodes later on, like, say, Friendship 1, where Joseph Carey dies on the surface of a planet trying to correct a disastrous first contact, you literally have a scene at the end of that episode where Janeway and Chakotay sit down, and Janeway asks, is all of this worth it? Is it worth going out into the universe if this is going to be the consequence of it? And, like, you can see that argument kind of continuing past 9/11 into Star Trek Enterprise, where there's this recurring motif of being very uncomfortable with the idea of Starfleet making contact with other races. And again, you can see it when you directly compare episodes of Enterprise that are kind of clearly inspired by other earlier episodes of Star Trek. So Dawn, for example, which is very clearly influenced by Darmok, in which a member of the crew is stranded on a hostile alien planet with an alien from a species with which he cannot communicate. In The Next Generation, in Darmok, the two of them strike up a friendship, and it becomes a meaningful point of first contact between two civilizations that have often struggled to communicate with one another. It's a very utopian, very idealized view of how contact works and how this kind of develops. In Dawn, Trip just about manages to survive with this hostile alien, and at the end, they basically agree to go their separate ways and leave each other alone forever afterwards. There's a real sense of kind of, well, surely we can all just leave each other alone. Or even like pick, say, a piece of the action from the original Star Trek series, the one in which Kirk accidentally becomes a gangster overlord of an entire alien planet, but it's treated as comedy. It's very playful, and like there's a sense of like celebrating Kirk's ingenuity and creativity. And you compare that to the Enterprise episode which riffs on that, which is The Communicator, in which Reed accidentally leaves his communicator behind on an alien planet, which leads to torture, brutality, suffering, and barely escaping with their lives without provoking an apocalyptic showdown. And there's a kind of a sense in Voyager and Enterprise of being very wary of this idea of contact. And then on the other hand, you have Deep Space Nine. And Deep Space Nine is very much like embraces the idea of multiculturalism, the idea that, if you throw all these cultures together in a big melting pot and make them as welcome as possible, they will, eventually the best ideas will win out. And by coming into contact with Starfleet, coming into contact with idealism, people will become better. Nog will have an opportunity to escape a culture that will never value him as much as it should. Rom, who has been abused by his brother because he isn't smart, his brain isn't wired for the business that is traditional in Ferengi culture, can actually find a job that allows him to focus on his strengths as an engineer. And like even Klingon culture, which has been corrupt and decadent, will eventually be kind of morphed and changed through contact with people like Worf, for example. And like even within that, there's a sense of Deep Space Nine being a little bit anxious about how that contact works. I mean, there's that moment in For the Cause where Eddington, who has run off and joined the Maquis, basically says to Sisko, the Federation are just as bad as the Borg. They just want to assimilate other cultures. They want to fold them into one another. They dream of the day when the Cardassians will join the Federation and kind of give up their own, established identity and become part of the gang, which is exactly what the Borg do, except the Borg are polite enough to tell you when they're going to assimilate you. And this is one of the things I find really interesting about the way that Discovery handles the Klingons. Because one of the criticisms, well, there are several criticisms of the way that Discovery handled the Klingons. First one is the makeup redesign. Which I understand on aesthetic levels, in that because you're switching from prosthetics to a full face mask, it is a lot harder for the actors to emote through the makeup. That is a practical concern, and I see that. And I think that is a legitimate problem with the Discovery Klingons. The other problem that people have with the Discovery Klingons is that they don't really look that much like the Klingons that we've grown up and become accustomed with. And that one, I'm probably I'm a bit less time for that one, because the Klingon makeup has always been changing. Like even in the original series, Kor and Koloth look like radically different makeup designs for the Klingons. But obviously then you have the Klingon commander played by Mark Zarek in the motion picture. But even then you have the makeup redesign shifting again in The Search for Spock. And again you have that Christopher Plummer makeup in Star Trek VI as well. And they're all radically different from one another. And they're no more or no less different than, the makeup that you see here is. And if you want Fanon to justify it, you can just say that, well, this is a result of botched plastic surgery after the events of that, arc in the fourth season of Star Trek Enterprise in Affliction and Divergence. After all those Klingons got flat foreheads, they all went to the plastic surgeon and they kind of overcompensated a little bit. More ridges, a lot more ridges going on there. And so that's one of the complaints about the Klingons that I don't necessarily buy. The other complaint about the Klingons is that they're portrayed as one-note villains throughout the season of Discovery. And that, this is obviously a betrayal of the Star Trek kind of ethos. The idea that, everybody should have a perspective and all perspectives are valid. And, we should try and understand other cultures. And again, Star Trek has a long history of doing this. We talked about, like, the Ferengi, who began as kind of one-note jokes and became this richly, weirdly complexly kind of imagined culture under Ira Steven Behr. But even the Cardassians, who are, like, literally space Nazis, but who end up being this kind of really complex, multifaceted and nuanced culture as Deep Space Nine kind of gets its hands on them. And like the thing with the Klingons in Discovery, and this is something that not enough people kind of discuss when they're talking about it, is T'Kuvma is entirely right. And it's arguably the one justification for using the prequel series, for making Discovery a prequel, is that T'Kuvma, in his argument against the Federation, in his attempt to rally the Klingon houses to him, he has a point. The Klingon Empire will not survive contact with the Federation in the way that it is now. its culture will radically change. And again, this is something that has been a point that's been made, as early as depending on whether they're going in universe, Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, where the idea of embracing the Federation is treated as this kind of point of potential cultural apocalypse. But if you're going in terms of outside the universe, the episode Heart of Glory in the first season of The Next Generation, in which you have these Klingons who are very anxious about the idea of what's happening to their culture after peace with the Federation, that Klingon mores and social values are breaking down. And if you watch The Next Generation and you watch Deep Space Nine, it becomes very, very clear that yes, actually contact with the Federation, and crucially peace with the Federation, is going to fundamentally alter the core dynamics of Klingon culture. The Klingons become corrupt and inept in The Next Generation. Look at episodes like Sins of the Father, for example, but even Reunion, or you want to go with the Redemption two-parter, where it's revealed that, the internal politics of the Klingon Empire are a mess, full of people who would sell out their own kind of nations and their own culture for power, if nothing else. Look at Deep Space Nine, for example, where Gowron, in a plot that is surprisingly prescient and actually reads really well as a commentary on the Iraq War, effectively manufactures a crisis on Cardassia in order to justify a war that will hold his people together and secure his power base, which is becoming increasingly precarious, and therefore throws the entire Alpha Quadrant into chaos in order to maintain his grip on power. And again, Gowron, over the course of Deep Space Nine, it's very clearly kind of doing whatever it takes to maintain his power and destroying kind of the Klingon Empire in order to do it. And again, Gowron was chosen as head of the Klingon Empire by none other than Jean-Luc Picard, our wonderful idealistic captain. Of course, it helps that his primary competitor was murdered by Worf. But, it's the swings and roundabouts, really. But what happens is, over the course of Deep Space Nine, you end up with Ezri making the point to Worf in Tacking into the Wind, which is one of the great Deep Space Nine episodes, that over the course of Worf's lifetime, the Klingon Empire has eroded to the point where it no longer looks like he imagined it would. It's been led by men who are weak, inept, and structures that are not strong enough to support institutional change. And so you end up with a situation where Starfleet and the Federation end up playing kingmaker to the Klingon Empire. And even Martok, who ends up being Klingon High Chancellor at the end of Deep Space Nine, he's nervous about the direction the Klingon Empire is taking. In You Are Cordially Invited, the one with Worf's marriage, there's a sequence where he's talking to Worf about how his wife, Grilla, the lady, Cirilla, is talking about how she's not really comfortable welcoming a Trill into the House of Martok, Worf's wife, Jadzia. And Worf is we need to learn to embrace other cultures. And Martok's we don't embrace other cultures. We conquer them. We are an empire. And again, you have this sense that through contact with Starfleet and the Federation, the Klingon Empire kind of falls and declines and kind of slips. And this idea of kind of pure Klingon identity, as outlined by T'Kuvma, does go. And again, you can argue whether that's a good thing. I imagine a lot of people subjugated by the Klingon Empire would agree that's a good thing. I think that perhaps a lot of viewers would also agree that it's a good thing. But I think that T'Kuvma's perspective on it, which is this empire which I love, this empire which I've, sort of built up this imagined ideal form of, these values which I've internalized, this culture which I hold up as an ideal, will not survive contact with We Come in Peace unless I take action against it. So his motivations make a great deal of sense. And his, I think the show recognizes that. And again, in terms of what the show is using the Klingons for, as a metaphor for, I think that's very pointed. I think it's very timely, and I think it's very astute.
The thing about T'Kuvma is he's not just a cardboard two-dimensional villain. He's not trying to do. You mentioned about the desire for power when the Klingons do break down. He's not after that. He's after his ideal, and he's very idealist in what he believes that the Klingons should be. And you've got to bear in mind that he's not one of the 24 houses. He's actually outside of that and doesn't belong within there. And he has to give his argument to the 24 houses. A lot of them, Cole doesn't really agree to what it is, and has his own opinions, and we'll catch up with him later in the season. But the way that they portray him, he starts talking about the purity in the race mix and of Andorians and Tellarites,
filthy
and
Andorians. What the hell did Andorians do? I want to know. That's the T'Kuvma origin story that I want. It's Tellarites, humans, Vulcans, and filthy Andorians, and you're what the hell happened to you and an Andorian?
Yeah.
And the Andorian said, "That's not my antenna." Quark reference. Quark reference.
But yeah, so he's really interesting in that way because he's not your typical, the way that he dies. He doesn't really put up a fight because he does get shot from Michael. And it's more about Michael's perspective, but it's all about how his ideals, his understanding, his isolationism to a degree that he does not want the purest form of who he is, where he's come from, and what they stand for. He doesn't want to infect that in the way that he believes will come to that. And as you say, with all those examples that you gave in the likes of Deep Space Nine, where the Klingons are that because of the Dominion War, that sort of decrepit and gone, that the Klingon Empire doesn't effectively exist anymore. And as I say, the likes of Picard having to step in those shows, it makes a big difference when you've got that. So other than that, though, they do have this ritualistic. Now that's always been part of it, and this is one of the things I was saying about the Romulans and having the 24 houses and stuff. I can see it being different sects and stuff, and they're trying to. With Cole with his paint on his face and things. His
dye and House Mokai with the kind of acne and like the jewellery that's on the faces of some of the other representatives as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and how they're trying to at least develop that. And do you think that's definitely a way that I feel that they're at least trying stuff like that? And then we'd also obviously then come to Vok. At this point, we don't know what's going to happen to Vok. But it did set the internet alight early on in the first few episodes. But what did you? How did you view Vok in this episode? Because he's obviously an albino within the Klingon Empire. That they're not part of the houses. And even to the point of T'Kuvma's history with the sarcophagus ship. When he was young, and the fact that both of them have this relationship together because of they are outcasts within the Klingons themselves.
Well, I think that Vok is a fascinating character. I think the actor Javed Iqbal has a really great career ahead of him.
He does, yeah.
I'm really looking forward to seeing what he does next. Being entirely honest, I think that one to watch really in terms of how the show goes. I also, again, the whole Vok situation is one of those great examples of kind of Discovery struggling with the idea of what prestige television means, and where prestige television means that the entire internet will solve your plot for you if you have any mysteries in it before you even get to air the episodes, particularly if you structure your season so that you take a big gap in the middle of it, where the internet will just solve all of your kind of mysteries and you will have no twist left by the end of it. It's a problem that happened quite frequently with Westworld as well, because again, the internet is a content farm. It's basically processing power. It's everybody on Twitter, on social media, trying to figure out where a story's going, and they will figure it out ahead of time. So Vok is kind of interesting in that regard, where it's like, you can't beat the internet in those terms, and it's probably a good idea that kind of, the show in its second season maybe leaned a little bit away from that, to be fair, to give credit where the second season, kind of doesn't always get credit from me. In terms of Vok and in terms of the Klingons, it's, again, this is one of the things where... And again, it's the way that T'Kuvma describes Vok, where he looks at Vok and he says, I don't see an outcast, I see a mirror. And again, this is one of the things that how storytelling works on Discovery that is maybe slightly different than fans of the original Star Trek or, Star Trek The Next Generation kind of traditionally approach narrative storytelling, is where everything exists as a mirror of itself, where, like, the death of Georgiou is obviously mirrored in the death of T'Kuvma. And therefore, like, our primary point of interest in the Klingons is going to be Vok, because Vok is the mirror to Burnham, because he has also lost his mentor, for example. He is also kind of like, he was taken under the wing of somebody who didn't see him as an outcast, who saw him as somebody who belonged and who fit in and had a place among people of his own species. And then watch that person die, and that had a profound emotional impact on him. And so, like, Vok is very clearly introduced as a mirror to Burnham. And again, this gets at something that's kind of interesting about the Klingons. And again, I mentioned that there were three main criticisms of the Klingons in certain kind of fan circles. And I mentioned one of them is that the makeup change. One of them is obviously the idea that they're not motivated. And the other one, which is kind of more interesting, is the idea that they're maybe a bit problematic in terms of what they represent, in that they are they might be seen as a monstrous other. And this was a very common criticism early in the first season, particularly after these 2 episodes aired, that there was a sense in which the Klingons, and again, you mentioned the difference between the various Klingon houses and like the effort that they go to differentiate between, say, Kol and the House of Mokai and places like that as well. And I think that that's very much to the show's credit, but you can arguably see the influence of fantasy television on Star Trek Discovery and the success of shows like Game of Thrones, where there is this attempt to almost give the show a fantasy sheen to it, a kind of a quality that perhaps reflects the storytelling of kind of popular genres at the time that it's being released more than, traditional Star Trek. So like it you could argue the Klingons look a little bit like orcs, for example, or the way in which the Romulans have been retooled in Picard is maybe a little bit elf-like, for example. Yeah, that sort of quality. Even though that's absolutely always been a quality. Vulcans have always kind of had that quality with the pointed ears and arched eyebrows and stuff like that. It's just that Picard really leans into it. And again, one of the criticisms of the Klingons in Discovery was a sense in which this was perhaps problematic, that they were a racial other, that they were kind of like maybe being coded in a way that was not necessarily particularly kind of flattering or particularly kind of like, again, inclusive or diversity friendly in the way that Star Trek traditionally has been. And I can understand that. And again, you'll see it happening like later on in the season where they eat Georgiou, for example, where they eat a living sentient creature. And there's a sense of them being portrayed as monstrous or other. And one of the things that I actually really like about Discovery is that the Klingons, over the course of the season, it becomes very clear, are a mirror to ourselves. They are not an alien other. They are actually us. And again, this is the thing where T'Kuvma's quotes, "Remain Klingon," are very much kind of rhetoric taken from the political right in the United States. The Klingons aren't standing in for Russians. They aren't standing in for the Chinese like they were when they were bronzed up in Errand of Mercy with the Fu Manchu goatees. No, this time the Klingons are very clearly us. And the show makes that very clear in the way that it structures the first season, where the Mirror Universe arc in the second half makes it clear that there's no real difference between the Terran Empire and the Klingon Empire. And therefore there's no real difference between the Terrans and the humans. Therefore, there's no real difference between the humans and the Klingons. And again, you have like literal juxtaposition of scenes. For example, you have the idea of, the characters eating Georgiou, the Klingons eating Georgiou to stay alive. But then you also have later on Mirror Georgiou eating Saru, or eating Mirror Saru, or eating a Kelpin. Which is very much the same process because that's how food chains work. And very much a sense that there's no real difference between us and them. And again, this is something that I think is interesting in terms of how the franchise has approached Klingons historically, where the Klingons have always typically been another. Obviously in Errand of Mercy, they were the Chinese. In The Undiscovered Country, they were the Russians after Chernobyl and the collapse of the sort of Berlin Wall. They're the idea of kind of like the Cold War finally being over. And again, this is something where Enterprise doesn't necessarily get enough credit, because Enterprise with Judgment, with the episode Judgment, the one that I mentioned earlier where you have the Klingon lawyer, realizes that Klingons are actually, they're us. They can be stand-ins for modern America. They can be reflections of humanity. If the Federation represents the best of humanity going forward, the Klingons perhaps represent the worst of humanity, or the worst impulses of humanity. And I think that it's interesting to kind of have that, because Vok very much gives you that. Because Vok is literally a mirror of Burnham. He's literally a mirror to our lead character. He's very much a reflection of her. And it's notable that over the course of the season, as I mentioned earlier, Vok will have a very similar arc to Burnham, where he has to reconcile these different sides of himself and to decide what part of himself is true, what part of himself is real. And I really like that aspect of Discovery's handling of the Klingons. I think that it's very clever, it's very smart, and it's very, again, it's almost lyrical would probably be the word that I would use. It's not necessarily logical, it's not necessarily kind of strictly narratively internally coherent, but it makes sense in terms of theme, and it makes sense in terms of kind of like structure. And I really, really like that about the show. So yeah, that would kind of be my take on Vok. Without getting, I'm wondering, are we assuming that people here have seen Discovery before?
Kind of, in general. But I think Vok is an exceptional case, though. I think that's probably best to leave it at that. But
yes.
I would, we are kind of rediscovering because I need to put that in every time I get an opportunity to. But But no, I think that you're absolutely right with that. I mean, I took that as the alt-right, and you know, if you take it a step further, then you are talking about humanity as a whole, not just a country or a race, because things like the alt-right and the right hand, you know, the right wings of many parties, and I think I mentioned this in one podcast I've done about 50 in the past 3 weeks, so forgive me if I forget which one it was, but we do have this uprising of right wings, whether it be in France or in you know, in England or wherever it may well be in the United States, and obviously that, you know, we're talking, you know, a few years back now, 3 years back, but the fact that they are dealing with that, and it's not just a case of this country or that country, it's not Russia, it's not China, where you could still do that to a degree, it's not Korea, or and you could still quite easily do that, but the fact that the mirror to America is obviously a major impact on this show as well, that you know, you can't do what you did 20 years ago, because the pieces on the board have completely and utterly changed. Yeah. And you've got to deal with these kind of things, but you have to deal with the pieces you've got now. If you have to repurpose the Klingons to do that. And as you say, the mirror, as you say, a mirror with Vok and T'Kuvma, that very kind of succinct thing that he says there, that, you know, we do look at what Vok does later on, and how Michael is involved in this situation is really kind of pertinent to what happens, and I think that's a really interesting counterpoint.
And there's a whole host of stuff there. Like, I mean, there's the fact that, you know, you could argue that a large part of what the resurgent right is doing at the moment is building this idea of unity. And again, like, you want to pick an example of the Republican Party in the States, where in any other country, it's been frequently joked the Republican Party would be three different parties. It would be fiscal conservatives, foreign policy hawks, and social conservatives. But they're not. They're one party. And in fact, they're often at odds with one another, and particularly during, say, the Bush era, where you have that kind of conflict within the Republican Party. And what you had in 2016 was you had this idea of a candidate who was an outsider, who didn't belong to one of the great houses of the Republican Party. Sorry, Jed Bush. But, you know, who basically kind of came in, stormed, and what he did. And one of the ways in which, you know, one of the arguments that people make about the success of Donald Trump, and you could arguably extend it to, say, the success of the Brexit campaign in the UK and to other far-right extremes as well, is that they do exactly what T'Kuvma does here. Is basically they lure people into a culture war. They create a kind of a sense of unrest or unease, and kind of build this narrative of kind of oppression and suffering, and kind of this idea that, you know, well, these people, these liberals are coming over here and they're going to prevent you saying what you want to say and doing what you want to do, and they represent a real existential threat to us. So we should really band together. Even though we disagree, even though we don't hold the same viewpoints whatsoever, you know, if you want to defeat Hillary Clinton in November, you need to get behind me and sort this out. And again, I think the show kind of touches on that. And I think that, you know, as much as we may joke about things like the Klingon 24 houses being a reference to Game of Thrones, or being clearly influenced by the great houses of Game of Thrones, or the conventions of fantasy television, which was increasingly popular at this point in history, I think that, like, making the Klingon Empire this discordant group of, like, easily distinguishable from one another, kind of like small ethnic tribes, basically, or small tribes, cultural tribes, helps sell that idea of kind of like what the alt-right has accomplished, or what Trumpism has accomplished in the States, or what Brexit has accomplished in the UK, which is taking these radically different definitions of kind of a political viewpoint, of conservatism, and basically finding a way to unite them all in opposition to a common enemy. Because again, you think of, and this is something I personally have trouble kind of reconciling with, which is, like, you know, as somebody who grew up Catholic, whose mother goes to mass, who lights a candle for his grandmother in a church, and who believes faith is a wonderful and powerful thing, I have difficulty understanding how people who have that level of religious belief can vote for a man who is so intemperate and in no way represents the virtues that I would associate with Christianity. And, you know, but you do, because he shares a common enemy with you. He presents this idea of, well, if you don't vote for me, they're going to come and they're going to close the churches or whatever. Or they're going to kind of create a climate in which you hold no real political power, and they're going to take all that away from you. And I think that Discovery kind of does that rather well in terms of portraying how that happened. And I think it also does a good job of capturing, you know, some of the complacency that happened on the left in response to it, where you have, you know, and you have Anderson's response to this situation is, well, sorry, Burnham, maybe you should have thought twice before defacing the artifact of a warrior race. Or, don't worry, they'll listen to reason when we sit down and talk to them. And it's the wonderful moment where Anderson is talking to Kuva, and he's basically like, look, it's okay, the adults are in the room, you can talk to me, let's figure this out. It's okay.
It's
which again,
the inability, the blind spot, isn't it? The kind of Johari window of that aspect, you know, that they just didn't see it coming, or they refused to believe that it was coming, yet the tide was showing that was going to happen.
And people were saying that it was a real possibility that was going to happen, but there was such complacency there. And again, that sense of like tone policing and like, whatever you say, don't say anything that could offend anybody. You know, don't actually say that this stuff is racist, because if you say it's racist, it's just going to make them uncomfortable. That sort of aspect of it. And again, these discussions that were happening within liberal culture. And again, this is arguably like what Star Trek needed to be doing in 2016, 2017, because Star Trek is, you know, it's an idealistic, progressive, utopian kind of television show. It's very much about imagining a future where everybody gets along and everybody is nice to one another, and everybody kind of has figured out the great problems and difficulties that face humanity and kind of found a way around those. And like in 2017, and again, this is something I think we talked about Picard, but it's this idea of, well, actually things are somehow more fraught than they were in the 90s. We need to figure out why things didn't go the way that we wanted them to go. We need to figure out how to fix that. We can't pretend that the old ways are working. We can't pretend that, you know, that the sort of like idealistic neoliberal globalization of the 90s is just going to work fine now, because it clearly hasn't, because we've lived in a society that has, you know, to a certain extent, at the very least, fractured on it, if not outright rejected it. And so we need to find a new way forward. And, you know, we need to find a new way forward culturally as a society, but we need to find a new way forward, you know, in terms of making a franchise that presents an idealized future of humanity. In 1994, the idealized future of humanity was basically imagine now plus 400 years. In 2016, the idealized future of humanity, nobody on either side of the political debate wants it to be imagine 2016 plus 400 years. I hope.
You would hope. If that was the case, I would want imprisonment for life. But no, I think we've come off to the end of the episode, and that's hence the reason why I said that. Now, what do you think to the final scene? I mean, have half the lights gone out and they've just got backlight or something, or what? We get to Michael Burnham's court-martialing, effectively, and they're very well lit. Is probably the best way of putting it. Or they're very well lit from the back.
Very atmospherically lit. Well, it's because after the lens flare, I think there was a big panic around Starfleet after that gigantic signal beacon.
Right.
I think they're worried about summoning 24 warships into the court-martial briefing room. So it was like, keep the lights low, no matter what you do not light the beacon. That's what we're doing here. No, I mean, it is very, very clearly atmospheric. And again, it's something that that's storytelling that you don't really see in terms of Star Trek that often. Because again, you look at the Berman era, and the Berman era has a very particular aesthetic, and that aesthetic is very flat. And again, I don't mean that in a bad way. I think there's actually some really well-directed episodes of television in the Berman era. Winrich Cobley was a fantastic director, to pick just one example of kind of aesthetic.
Course, of Millennium Lumini as well. Winrich Cobley, wasn't he? So
he was indeed, and David Livingston as well he's a director that I really, really admire when he works on Star Trek. I think particularly when he works on Enterprise, where he has a great deal more freedom in terms of what he's doing. But one of the things that is interesting about like Discovery and the way Discovery looks, and you'll notice that even though he didn't get to pick Edgar Wright to direct it, you'll notice that Discovery is a lot more in conversation with like the modern expectations of television direction. And you'll notice it throughout the episode. There's a number of shots which are consciously showing off. And I'm not just talking in terms of budget. Like if you look at how classic Berman era Star Trek is shot and scored, for example, it's very much kind of very generic kind of television. It's very much kind of like presenting, this is the story. What you're interested in primarily is the dialogue that's being delivered and the actors who are delivering the dialogue. There's very little kind of heightened stylization information there. Whereas if you're watching these episodes, I watched them back to back last night twice, you'll notice the camera is a lot more fluid, it's a lot more moving, there's a lot more kind of emphasis on the camera as a way of kind of heightening the audience's experience. So you have, for example, the sequence where Saru and Burnham are kind of arguing over the kind of threat that the Klingons pose, and the camera is just whirling around. That's it, exactly. Yeah. It's kind of circling the two of them, and it's hard to keep track of. If you've watched Star Trek, you would expect that to be shot in a standard kind of two-shot, back and forth, cutting back and forth between them as they exchange dialogue, so it's very clear. But instead, the camera whirls around them, and it becomes disorienting and kind of uncomfortable and really weird. And so you have the heightening of stakes, where you get to the point where the mutiny almost seems inevitable, because you're trapped. And again, this is because Michael Burnham is our protagonist. You are trapped inside Michael's headspace. Everybody else on the ship thinks that things are relatively grand. We're in a very tense situation, but nothing we haven't been in before. But Burnham is kind of spiraling at that point, and the camera's literally spiraling with her as well. But even little shots, like, say, the opening of Battle at the Binary Stars, where you have that sequence 7 years earlier, where Burnham and Georgiou, walk from the transporter room up to the bridge. It's quietly showy in a way that Star Trek direction, on television at least, hasn't traditionally been quietly showy, where the camera follows them down a corridor, into the turbolift, pushes in close to them in the turbolift, in what appears to be a single shot, moves between the pair of them, moves behind them, and then shows you the doors opening on the bridge, which is very much a shot that exists primarily to draw your attention as a television viewer and make you go, wow, do they actually have a lift that works? As opposed to kind of like, well, we could disguise this with a very quick cut. It's remarkable how it happens. And again, that's very much what you get at the end of the episode with that sequence where she's being judged. And again, the influence of Star Trek 6 on this, the Nicholas Meyer film, where it feels very much like that Klingon tribunal in which, McCoy and Kirk find themselves, where it's lit very strongly on them, but the judge is kind of lit almost in silhouette. And again, that's arguably putting us in Burnham's perspective, because she's depressed, she's lost everything. This is the darkest place that she has ever been. So, literally, the camera puts us in the darkest place that she's ever been. It doesn't matter who the faces of the judges kind of convicting her are, because she knows that she's guilty. She's judging herself. And again, it's very important that, like, as this is happening, while she's going to be sentenced by the Starfleet Tribunal, it's very much Burnham pronouncing a verdict on herself, because that's the story that we're watching. We're not watching Burnham, we're not watching an A-Team episode where Burnham is sent to prison for a crime she didn't commit. We're watching Burnham sentence herself, basically, and hold herself responsible, and acknowledge that she made a mistake that led to countless lives being lost, and basically coming to terms with that over the course of the season. So the actual judges in that sequence are entirely incidental. They're simply there to offer exposition, to articulate the crimes, and to explain why, when the next episode picks up, she's on a prison transport being moved around. And then, so I really like that the episode kind of is willing to do something that is as heightened, is as weird, is as kind of out of the norm for Star Trek.
Well, the thing is, I mean, you say that about that particular scene with the backline. I know I was being a bit facetious with it, but it's that point exactly, isn't it? In any other show, or not any other show, but any other scene, if you were watching that, you would be focused on the people giving the sentence to the person, because you'd be focused in on that. But we are very much focused in on Michael herself. So the fact that you're seeing blank faces, you're seeing them in shadow, it gives more emphasis to what Michael is doing and what she's having to go through, rather than actually, introducing more characters or asking, who are these? You just get almost like the Federation are a faceless consortium. To use an X-Files term, where they don't matter. It's what is Mike. What's Michael's issue, and where is she right now?
And I think that's important. I think that's like something that does mark Discovery as different from the other Star Trek shows. And I kind of not to jump too far ahead, I think the second season maybe loses some of that a little bit, but I think that it's a really strong through line through the first season and kind of holds it all together.
Yeah, so now that we've had our discussion on the episode, I think it's time to turn it over to the Facebook group and to find out what they thought of it in our Make It So, a Star Trek podcast fan group. So we'll do that now. Craig Mackenzie, who will be on the show again. He says, a strong and enjoyable start to the new era of Star Trek, though I wonder if this would have been better served as a flashback that played out over the course of the season, as it's not really a proper start to what Discovery would be. It does introduce a central character, but it might have been better to slowly answer the reason she was branded a mutineer for a longer period of time, rather than presenting what essentially amounts to a different show in the first 2 episodes. Just a thought. I can see what he's saying, and I think, we had that a lot in Picard, didn't we, with flashbacks regarding it. I mean, this is very much a directed point in time that we might see that. And I can see that happening. I could see that being a potential way of doing it. But from what you said earlier in this episode, I don't think it would be something that you would potentially agree with. Just because of the type of episode it is. What do you think to that idea, just as a general thought?
Yeah, I mean, I can see why you might make that work, or why that might be a way of doing it. But I honestly think that the way that the episode is structured, the way the season is structured, and the way in which it opens with something as forceful as this is very necessary, because it's very important that, like, Discovery break with the past. It's very important that Discovery make it clear that it is doing its own thing. And I think that giving you half an hour of Georgiou as the new Picard. And again, part of me thinks that one of the biggest issues with this is that, like, they credit Michelle Yeoh as a special guest star instead of series lead. I would have absolutely loved if they credited her as series lead, because a lot of the publicity around it did. They included her in photos in Starfleet uniform with Jason Isaacs, for example, and she was announced as a series regular and stuff like that. And she got a lot of press as well, where there was a sense that, oh, she's going to be a major player in this new Star Trek show. The only problem is that I think it leaked quite early that she wasn't going to be around for that long. And I think that the special guest star as well credit makes it very clear that you won't be seeing Michelle Yeoh past this 2-parter, or you won't be seeing this version of Michelle Yeoh past this 2-parter, which is a shame, because I think that if you'd actually gone the whole hog and actually done, Star Trek Shenzhou starring Michelle Yeoh, and then brutally pulled out the kind of like the rug from under the audience, I think it would have been even better. That said, I also imagine that there would have been fires on the internet had they done something as bold as that. But part of me kind of wishes that they did. Also worth noting, by the way, actually, I just remembered, we were talking on Discovery, we were talking on the Picard about the use of star dates and how the kind of Kurtzman-Goldman era's moved past this. It's notable that the only time, or one of the few times on Discovery that we actually hear a proper star date, is on the Shenzhou. Which is very much like, this is traditional Star Trek. The Shenzhou is Berman era Star Trek, basically.
But also on that, though, she says the star date, but then says it's a Sunday in May or something like that afterwards as well, which is almost like, this is probably the last time we'll hear it moving on. I don't know if does it not happen again in the rest of the season?
I don't know, actually, but that's kind of stood out to me on rewatch, because there's a lot of, because the show does move away from using star dates, particularly using the logs in the way that they've traditionally been used on Star Trek as a means of delivering exposition, whereas here it's very much, this is a traditional Star Trek log, albeit with the Sunday in there as well, where you get that kind of statement of like, beauty is born from destruction, which is like, well, and welcome to talking about behind the scenes on Star Trek Discovery. It does seem kind of pointed now that we've heard from Chabon, and as I say, going past that star date and choosing the days. So it is what it is. It's the world in which we live in now. There's no, it's arbitrary for me. I know a lot of people would be kind of, they really like the star dates, and I get it. I understand that. But, I understand.
But it's not really my sort of thing. I couldn't be bothered to work them out, to be honest. I don't have the time.
I mean, I do like star dates in that they are sufficiently alien. And again, there's no real way to make them make sense, because they add an extra digit here and there, and some of the ones are earlier and later and stuff like that over the course of the original Star Trek, and kind of how you keep track of them doesn't really make sense. But I like that they suggest that there's a different way of keeping time in Star Trek than we're used to. And I do like that. Like, again, for all... On this podcast, it sounds like I'm being iconoclastic. I'm like, yeah, burn old Star Trek. I love old Star Trek. I adore old Star Trek. I just understand that, sometimes you need to move away from the old towards something new. And I appreciate that. So I adore. Like, I will not hear you besmirch star dates, even though I think that, it's maybe not a bad thing that we move past them. I don't think that, their loss is something that demands a brass funeral or anything like that.
No.
But
yeah, I mean, as I say, it's not something I can give or take. It wouldn't make any difference to me either way, but when you look back at Next Generation and they say the star date and they open up with the log, then that is nostalgic for me, that you do have those star dates, and I have no qualms with that whatsoever. But it's just interesting how these comments have been made, and then when we go back to see season 1 of Star Trek Discovery, and you see that, and then you see the fact that she says a star date and then says what day it is, then that seems more obvious now compared to what it would have been maybe a year ago. So that's where I'm getting at, really. With that.
And a lot of it's very obvious in hindsight, actually, as well, because, again, even stuff like, say, Burnham being Spock's kind of adopted sibling, which, again, is something that you notice becomes a trope of the Berman era when you have Sung in Star Trek Picard, who is a human sibling of Data as well. Yeah. So you get these things that are kind of recurring motifs, and it's very clear that they're, if you want to be cynical, you could say that they're kind of cash-ins and ways to tie our new characters to established characters. But when you look at them, there's enough of them that you start to wonder if there's a reason why they're doing these things, and maybe they're, conscious choices that reflect kind of an aesthetic rather than just random decisions that were made for convenience, which I think is interesting. Now that we have like enough kind of Kurtzman, Goldsman era Star Trek to start doing stuff like this.
Yeah, and it is something I want to mention at the start, was that Goldsman was actually brought in as a producer on Discovery at this point as well. That was part of Fuller bringing him in as well, I believe. So,
I didn't stay that long though. Again, spoilers.
yeah. Okay. So next one is from AJ Black, our good friend Tony. I'll be honest, he says, I was genuinely surprised at how great these first 2 episodes were when watching them with some distance. It feels like a terrific bridge between the old and new eras of Star Trek, something that we both mentioned, blending those stylistics.
Terrific bridge.
Yeah, perfect bridge. I mean, it's good that he's rediscovering these episodes. I think it's amazing. So blending those stylistics and telling a strong plot at the same time. It's just more of a prologue as a pilot or a mix of both, so that makes it fairly unique. Much is really good, much better than I remembered. And then someone called Kurt North replied back and said, just wondering if that's how you will feel on the Soljay, Narek and Narissa, given some distance. Only time will tell. And then he puts a meme on, which is basically, you'll have to see it to see what the meme is, but you can imagine what type of meme that is. It's definitely not accepting that under any circumstance. So then we've got Alyssa Linfield Pratt, who says, I love these 2 episodes of Discovery. Great setup for the season and into the new 2010s era Trek. I absolutely adored Giorgio in these episodes, and that's the reason why I watch these 2 eps over and over again. So that was it. That was it for our mailbag this week. So thank you very much, Darren, for coming on and talking the first 2 episodes of Discovery. We'll no doubt see you again on Make It So in the future. But in the meanwhile, where can people find you online, and what are you up to at the moment?
Yep, you can find me online. I'm at the Movie Blog. We've actually written a bunch of Star Trek reviews. I think I may have written some reviews of the first couple episodes of Discovery as well before I got distracted by the Dublin Film Festival that year.
You did.
Because I have the attention span of a 2-year-old. But I also written reviews of kind of all the old Star Trek as well. Well, not all the old. Everything except the final 3 seasons of The Next Generation. So I've written about Voyager, I've written about Deep Space Nine, the original series, and Enterprise as well. So you can find those reviews with just a quick Google at the Movie Blog with a 0 instead of an O in the word movie. I also co-host a podcast with my good friend Andrew Quinn called The 250, in which we journey through the IMDb's top 250 movies of all time, one movie at a time. And so the week that patrons will be listening to this, we'll be discussing The Wonderful Portrait of a Lady on Fire, which is the French film from Céline Sciamma, which is a new entry on the list. We'll be discussing that with the wonderful Aoife Barry from The Journal. We'll be discussing it with Charlene Lydon from Element Pictures and the Lighthouse Cinema in Dublin, and film director Rena Gregor will be joining us as well for that one. If you are not a patron listening to the podcast, you can join us the week after that, in which we'll be teaming up with the wonderful folks from When Irish Eyes Are Watching to discuss the very interesting portrayal of Irish culture in Guy Ritchie's Snatch as part of our continuing world tour.
Good stuff. Well, you can find me at rmuldrake, that's RMULDRAKE on Twitter. That's the best place to find me. And of course, the Make It So we'll continue on over the next few weeks going through season 1 of Discovery, and we'll see where that takes us. And obviously, once season 3 does start to come out, if there's any new trailers, any new material, I'm sure that Tony and myself will look into them and see how we're getting on with that. You'll also find me on the Time Is Now, the Millennium podcast that I show run, which is coming back in the next week or so. And you'll find Darren on that. We're talking about Luminary as it happens. So you'll be on there, Darren, won't you? So
I will.
That'll all be good. But to find that...
I hope it'll be an enlightening conversation.
You can look to the skies, just look to the skies, and hopefully things will come to you. And
if I have any troubles, I'll ask you a question. I'll ask you a question.
People that don't watch Millennium are not going to get that.
I think they'll get it. I think they'll understand it's an episode about Alaska and skies.
And some Aurora Borealis, or whatever it's called. Northern Lights or Southern Lights. Or which lights are they? They'll be Northern, won't they? Northern Lights. It's been a long day.
We've already gone stir crazy.
So that's...
Kirk can't even look at the stars, people.
I can't. And to be honest, I'm actually sitting here in the pitch black now because it's been 2 hours and the sun is set and it's dark. But yes, the Time Is Now, so that you can find that on at the Time Is Now pod on Twitter. And don't forget to listen in at the end of this episode where we'll show you some brief clips on what's been happening on the network as well. So again, thank you very much, Darren, for coming on. And until next week or the next Discovery themed episode, we'll set a course for that and engage.
Previously on the We Made This network. Pick up a podcast.
One thing they don't teach you, or there's no one thing you're not prepared for when you start podcasting is the overwhelming imposter syndrome you have. Sometimes you're like, dude, especially in this case because there was no other Outer Limits podcast, and so I'm like, dude, if I have to hit the ground running, if it sucks, I mean, if you're the 10th Outer Limits podcast and you suck, whatever. But if you're the only one, so many people have in their mind what they want to hear.
Without a mouse.
How was your Disney trip anyway?
Yeah, it was great. I've really enjoyed it. I got my photo taken with an Elvis impersonator at the front gate on the outside of Disney World. And
I can't believe you managed to kick Mickey, Goofy and Donald Duck in the balls.
Yeah.
All three.
Went for the hat trick.
Yeah, the Holy Trinity.
And apparently I'm the first person who's actually successfully done that in the whole of the world.
Yeah.
So they'll be writing books about me.
They will do.
I also was really glad that I only got food poisoning 3 times. What was out there this time?
A new record for Disney.
Yeah, and a new record for me as well.
Please don't sue us, Disney. I'm sure everything is fine. Or if you have got food poisoning, they'll make you leave the park first before declaring it's food poisoning.
Pick a disc.
If we look at Marilyn and then we look at Too Late to Die Young, we start to realize that Dan Byrne has kind of a cultural fascination with some of the figures of his parents' generation, because he's talking about Elvis and James Dean and Marilyn Monroe, and a couple of the other songs have references to Muhammad Ali and Pete Rose. Pete Rose and Roberto Clemente are in this song, Marlon Brando. So he does have this fascination that I think some people criticize him for. I think he's been like, hey, if this is supposed to be a Gen X Bob Dylan, then why is he fascinated with all the same figures that the baby boomers were fascinated with?
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network. Make It So, a Star Trek Universe podcast, was created and is produced and hosted by Tony Black and Kurt North. You can find the show on Twitter at Jean-Luc Podard and on Facebook in the Make It So, a Star Trek podcast fan group discussion group. Check out the We Made This network at We Made This Pod on Twitter and on Facebook by typing in We Made This, and you can find all of our shows on our website, wemadethispod.com. Thanks for listening.